There is a continent sitting at the bottom of the world that holds secrets so old, so buried, so deliberately overlooked by mainstream history that most people have never heard a single word about them. Not because the evidence doesn't exist. It does. Not because no one has looked. People have looked, and what they found changed them. But because some discoveries are so uncomfortable, so resistant to the tidy explanations we've built our understanding of human history upon, that the easier thing, the more convenient thing, is simply to say nothing at all. Tonight, we're going to say something. We're going to walk slowly through the red dust and the ancient stone and the forgotten waterways of a land that was shaped, rearranged, and possibly governed by a civilization so early and so sophisticated that we don't yet have the language to describe it properly. If you're watching this to fall asleep, that's exactly why I make these videos. Maybe subscribe and let me know where are you right now and what time is it. Close your eyes for just a moment and try to picture Australia not as it appears on a modern map, not as the sunburned island continent of kangaroos and coral reefs and eucalyptus smoke, but as it was. Really was. 60,000 years ago, perhaps 80,000, perhaps longer than even our most conservative scientific estimates dare suggest. Picture a landscape that stretches further than it does today, because the seas were lower then, and the edges of the continent reached out into what is now open ocean. Picture rivers that no longer exist, flowing through valleys that are now desert. Picture lakes the size of small seas shimmering in regions that receive almost no rainfall today. Picture a sky enormous and unbroken above a land that had never known a fence, a road, a quarried stone placed deliberately by human hands. And then picture something else, something that doesn't fit. Stone arrangements extending for miles across open ground, aligned with precision to astronomical events that the builders could not have calculated without sustained, multi-generational observation of the sky. Channels cut through rock in patterns too regular to be the work of water alone. Earthworks raised on flat plains in shapes that only reveal their full geometry from the air. Underground caverns that bear the marks of tools on their walls, not random scratching but systematic, purposeful work. Wells sunk into the earth to depths that even modern engineers would find ambitious, in locations where the water table should have been unreachable to people working without metal. These things exist. They are not legend. They are not the invention of romantic travelers or credulous enthusiasts. They have been documented by surveyors, examined by archaeologists, photographed from aircraft, studied from satellite imagery, and in almost every case, quietly set aside. Not disproven, set aside, because the questions they raise are more difficult to answer than anyone in a position of academic authority has been willing to admit publicly. What happened here, in this place, in this deep stretch of time before recorded history even begins to flicker? Who were the builders, and what did they know? And why, across the entire span of mainstream historical inquiry, has Australia been treated as a continent without ancient mystery, without lost civilizations, without the kind of deep structural past that archaeologists pursue so passionately on every other landmass on Earth? That last question, maybe, is the most interesting one of all. Let us begin at the beginning. Or rather, let us begin somewhere near what we currently believe to be the beginning, because the honest answer is that we don't know where the beginning actually is. And that uncertainty is itself one of the most important things we will discuss tonight. The conventional story of human arrival in Australia places the first people on the continent somewhere between 50 and 65,000 years ago. This was already a revolutionary revision when it was established, because for most of the 20th century, the accepted date was much more recent, closer to 40,000 years, and before that even more recent still. Every time new evidence has emerged, the date has been pushed back further. And every time the date has been pushed back, the implications have become more startling. Because 65,000 years ago is not just old in the way that ancient Rome is old, or even in the way that the pyramids are old. It is old in a way that our minds genuinely struggle to hold. It predates the oldest cave paintings in Europe by more than 20,000 years. It predates the construction of any monument anywhere in the world by at least 55,000 years. It means that the people who first walked onto Australian soil were doing so at a time when Neanderthals still roamed Europe, and the shape of the human story was so different from what came later that we can barely recognize it as the same tale. And yet here is what the standard history tells us about what those people did during all that time. They lived as hunter-gatherers. They moved across the land following seasonal resources. They developed complex spiritual traditions and a profound relationship with the landscape. They did not build, they did not engineer, they did not construct megastructures, but the ground itself tells a different story. Across the northern coast of Queensland, there are fish trap systems built from stone that extend for several kilometres along the tidal flats. The traps are constructed with a sophistication that suggests their builders had deep knowledge of tidal patterns, fish behaviour, and hydraulic engineering principles. The stones are not randomly placed. They form channels and chambers and funnel systems designed to allow fish to enter at high tide and to prevent their escape as the water retreats. Marine biologists who have studied these structures note that they would have provided a reliable and abundant food source for large populations, not the kind of intermittent harvest that a small nomadic band would need, but the kind of steady, predictable yield that could support a settled or semi-settled community numbering in the thousands. Some of these fish trap systems are very old. Dating stone structures without organic material is methodologically difficult, but researchers examining the sediment beneath certain traps and the biological growth on specific stones have suggested that some components may be 8,000 years old or older. Others may be considerably younger, because structures of proven utility tend to be maintained and extended across generations. What we see today may represent the most recent layer of a tradition of aquacultural engineering that stretches back much further than we have yet been able to confirm. But let us leave the fish traps for a moment and move inland, because the coast, extraordinary as it is not where the deepest mysteries are buried. In the interior of the continent, in the vast red and ochre landscapes of Central Australia, there are features in the earth that have no clean explanation. Let me describe one of them. A site that sits in a region so remote that most Australians have never heard its name, and most international visitors would never think to seek it out. Imagine standing on a flat plain in the early morning, before the heat has built to its full ferocity. The ground around you is hard-packed red clay, dotted with saltbush and spinifex, interrupted occasionally by the angular silhouettes of stones that have been here since before memory. In the distance, the horizon is impossibly flat and impossibly far away, the way horizons are in the Australian interior, where the sky feels like it begins at your feet. You have walked here from a vehicle track 3 hours distant, following a route described to you by someone who heard it from someone else, passed along in the informal network of people who pay attention to the land in ways that official surveys do not, and then you see it, stretched across the ground before you, visible in the low angle of morning light because the shadows throw the geometry into relief, is an arrangement of raised earth and stone that covers perhaps 40 hectares. The arrangement is not random. There are parallel lines. There are curves that describe arcs, so regular they could have been drawn with a compass. There are intersections and junctions that suggest a planned layout, something designed before it was built, something that existed first as an idea and then was imposed upon the landscape through sustained physical effort. The raised sections are low, worn down by tens of thousands of years of weather and by the slow, patient compression of the red earth. But they are there. They are real, and they were made by hands. Now, who made them, when, and for what purpose? These are questions that the land does not answer easily. And they are questions that official channels have been slow to pursue with the urgency they deserve, partly because of the complexity of navigating the relationship between scientific inquiry and indigenous cultural ownership, and partly because the answers, if they were ever fully established, would require a very significant revision of our understanding of what was possible in this part of the world at this point in time. Let me be precise about what I mean when I say our understanding would need revision. The dominant model of Australian prehistory holds that the Aboriginal peoples of Australia were sophisticated in their knowledge of the land, complex in their social and spiritual organisation, and innovative in their use of fire and ecology as management tools. but fundamentally non-architectural. That is, they did not build permanent structures. They did not create the kind of landscape-scale engineering that we see in other ancient civilizations. The assumption has been that the continent's history, however deep and rich in other ways, was one of continuity without the kind of monumental building that leaves unmistakable marks in the earth. But this assumption has been challenged, quietly and persistently, by people who have spent time in the landscape rather than in the literature. One of the most compelling challenges comes not from a formal archaeological excavation, but from the accumulated observations of pastoral workers, boundary riders, and station managers who have worked in remote Australia over the past century and a half. These are people whose livelihood depended on knowing the land intimately, and many of them, over the course of their careers, encountered things in the landscape that they could not explain and that no one in authority showed any interest in investigating. The accounts are varied. Stone walls running for miles across country where there was no colonial-era reason to build walls. Terracing on hillsides where no agriculture was thought to have been practiced. Circular depressions in the earth that could not be explained by geology, and that showed, on examination, the remnants of worked stone around their edges. Underground passages discovered accidentally by stock that fell through collapsed roofs. Passages that extended for distances greater than any natural cavity formation would suggest. Arrangements of large stones in patterns that seemed too deliberate to be natural and too geometrically precise to be random. Most of these accounts were never formally documented. A few were, and the few that were documented share something interesting. They were documented, they were briefly examined by someone with relevant credentials, and then they were categorized in ways that made further investigation seem unnecessary. The stone walls were identified as sheep yards built by early settlers, even when the style of construction bore no resemblance to any technique used in the colonial period. The terracing was attributed to natural geological processes, even when the consistent angle and spacing of the terraces suggested otherwise. The underground passages were described as natural caves without follow-up examination of the worked stone. This pattern, the pattern of documentation followed by dismissal, is not unique to Australia. It appears wherever discoveries are made that challenge the established timeline. But in Australia, it has been particularly consistent, and the reasons for that consistency are worth examining. Part of it is genuinely methodological. Australian archaeology is underfunded and understaffed relative to the scale of the continent and the depth of its human history. There are vast regions that have never been systematically surveyed. The professional researchers who do exist are stretched thin across an area larger than the continental United States, working with budgets that would be considered inadequate in countries with a fraction of Australia's landmass. In that context, it is perhaps understandable that anomalies are not always followed up with the thoroughness they deserve. But part of it is something else. Part of it is the weight of assumption. The prior belief that Australia has no ancient architecture is so deeply embedded in the field that evidence to the contrary tends to be interpreted through the lens of that belief rather than examined on its own terms. An anomalous stone arrangement in North America might prompt an excavation and a radiocarbon dating program. The same arrangement in Australia is more likely to prompt a note in a site register and nothing further. This is not a conspiracy. It is something more ordinary and in some ways more troubling than a conspiracy. It is the normal operation of academic paradigms, the way established models of the past filter and shape the interpretation of new evidence. It is the same process that delayed the recognition of Viking presence in North America, the same process that initially resisted the evidence for ancient human settlement of the Americas at dates earlier than the Clovis model suggested. It is how human knowledge works, and it is also how human knowledge sometimes fails. Let us now talk about water. Water in Australia is everything. The continent is the driest inhabited landmass on Earth. Its interior receives so little rainfall that it can barely support the sparse vegetation that currently grows there. The seasonal rivers that once crossed the continent's heartland have mostly shrunk to chains of waterholes, dry for most of the year. The Great Lakes that filled low-lying basins during wetter climatic periods are now salt pans, their former shorelines marked by the bleached remnants of aquatic life from a time when this was a different world. Understanding water, controlling water, storing water has been a matter of survival in this landscape for as long as humans have lived here. And the evidence suggests that, at some point, the people who lived here understood water in ways that go considerably beyond what a simple hunter-gatherer existence would require. Consider the channel system of the Budge Bim landscape in southwestern Victoria. This one is not disputed. It is not hidden. It has been formally recognized and studied, and in 2019 it was added to the UNESCO World Heritage List. It is, by the assessment of the archaeologists who have examined it, the oldest aquaculture system in the world, at least 6,600 years old, and possibly considerably older. It consists of channels, weirs, and traps constructed from stone and clay across a wetland system, designed to manage the movement of eels and other fish through the landscape. The system is sophisticated enough that when researchers modeled its hydraulics, they found that it would have provided reliable harvests across seasonal variation in rainfall and water flow. It was not opportunistic fishing. It was managed production. What the Budge Bim system demonstrates is not just the technical capability of its builders, but the social organization required to build it. Channels of that length and complexity cannot be dug by individuals or even small family groups. They require coordinated labor. They require planning that extends across seasons, perhaps years. They require a level of social organization that implies leadership, decision-making structures, and the kind of collective commitment to a shared project that we usually associate with settled agricultural societies. And Budge Bim is the one we know about because it has been formally studied. How many others exist in the unmapped interior that have not received the same attention? The answer, based on the accounts of those who have traveled in remote Australia with attention to such things, is that the channel systems are not limited to southwestern Victoria. Similar features, varying in scale and preservation, have been described in regions across the continent, in the Kimberley, in the Channel Country of southwestern Queensland, in parts of the Northern Territory where seasonal flooding creates conditions suited to exactly the kind of aquacultural management that the Budge Bim system embodies. Not all of these descriptions come with the precision and documentation that would satisfy a formal scientific review, but their consistency across regions, reported by people with no connection to each other and no shared agenda, suggests that the Budge Bim system was not an isolated innovation, but a widespread tradition. A tradition of landscape-scale hydraulic engineering, practiced across a continent, for longer than we have yet been willing to measure. This brings us to one of the most contested and most fascinating bodies of evidence in Australian ancient history, the stone arrangements. There are thousands of them. That number alone should give us pause. In a landscape that official history describes as home to small mobile bands of hunter-gatherers who left no permanent structures, there are thousands of deliberate arrangements of stone scattered across every region of the continent. Some are small, some are enormous. Some form geometric patterns. Some depict animals or human figures. Some align with the sun or the moon. Some are located on the approaches to water sources or on ridgelines that would have commanded extensive views. And the vast majority of them have never been formally documented in any comprehensive way. The ones that have been studied reveal a range of purposes that is itself extraordinary. Some appear to be ceremonial, related to the complex ritual traditions that the Aboriginal peoples of Australia maintained across their history. Some appear to be calendrical, marking the positions of celestial events at specific times of year, functioning as astronomical instruments in the same way that Stonehenge and the megalithic monuments of Europe have been understood to function. Some appear to be navigational, marking routes across country in the way that cairns and waymarkers function in other traditions. And some, the ones that are most difficult to explain, appear to be structural, the remnants not of markers or monuments but of buildings. The word building may seem like an overstatement when applied to stone arrangements that today appear as low ridges of rock barely rising above the surrounding ground. But consider what 60,000 years of weathering does to even the most robust stone construction. Consider what the freeze-thaw cycles of temperate regions do to mortared walls, let alone dry stone arrangements in the harsh variable climate of interior Australia. Consider that the tallest of the Egyptian pyramids stands today more or less as it was built, in part because it was built with enormous stone blocks and a geometry designed to resist collapse, but that far more modest structures built with less precise technique have long since been reduced to their foundations or less. What we see today in the Australian landscape may be the faintest shadow of what once stood. There are sites where the shadow is more substantial. In the highlands of southeastern Australia, in regions that receive enough rainfall to have supported a more complex ecology in the past, there are stone arrangements that have a different quality from the flat geometric patterns of the interior. Here, the stones are gathered into configurations that suggest not markers or monuments, but rooms, enclosed spaces, areas defined by stone that could have contained, sheltered, and organized life. The walls are low now, too low to provide meaningful shelter by themselves. But stone walls that stood 2 or 3 meters high at their construction would need only to lose half their height to be functionally comparable to what we find in these sites. And the loss of that height, over even just a few thousand years of frost and flood, and the slow toppling effect of plant root systems, is entirely expected. The people who have examined these sites most closely are not archaeologists, for the most part. They are people whose relationship with the Australian landscape is more direct and more sustained than the brief field seasons of academic research allow. And what they describe with a consistency that is difficult to dismiss is not random stone scatter, it is architecture, layout, design, the organization of space in ways that reflect the needs of people who lived in that space not just occasionally but continuously. Let me tell you about one particular set of these sites that has been the subject of persistent interest and persistent official silence for more than half a century. In a region of New South Wales that I will describe only generally, because the specifics are sensitive, and because the communities whose ancestral country this is have not uniformly welcomed outside attention to these sites, there is a complex of stone arrangements that extends across several interconnected valleys. The individual components of the complex are varied. There are what appear to be walls connecting natural outcrops of stone, walls that are clearly made from gathered material placed in deliberate linear patterns rather than from stone that fell or was deposited there naturally. There are circular features that range from a few meters to several tens of meters in diameter. There are elevated platforms of gathered stone, flat on top, that offer unobstructed views across the surrounding landscape. And there are, in several locations, what appear to be the remnants of more substantial structures, areas where the density of worked stone suggests that something more significant once stood. The complex was first formally noted in the historical record in the 1950s, when a grazier encountered the central grouping while searching for a missing animal. He was sufficiently struck by what he found to report it to the local historical society. The Historical Society wrote a letter to the State Archaeological Authority. The State Archaeological Authority sent a representative who spent 2 days at the site and filed a report describing it as an unusual concentration of natural stone with possible Aboriginal ceremonial significance. No excavation was recommended. No dating was attempted. The site was registered in the relevant inventory with a classification that effectively discouraged further investigation, and there the matter rested in official records. But it did not rest in the memory of the people who continued to notice it. Over the following decades, the site was visited by a number of individuals who had heard of it through informal channels. Some were researchers working outside the mainstream. Some were Aboriginal elders whose families had maintained connections to this country across the colonial disruption. Some were simply people who were drawn to old things and who trusted the evidence of their own eyes over the convenient categories of official classifications. And what they found, consistently, was a site that resisted the simple explanation offered in that 1950s report. The walls were too regular to be natural. The platforms were too level. The circular features were positioned in relationship to each other in ways that suggested plan rather than chance. And in several locations, when surface stone was carefully moved aside to examine the ground beneath, the investigators found evidence that had not been visible in the cursory official examination. Compacted soil forming precise floors, ash deposits at specific locations suggesting repeated use as hearths. And in one place, the remains of post holes, the small cylindrical voids left in the ground when wooden structural elements decay away, arranged in a pattern consistent with the roof supports of a substantial enclosed space. Post holes. In a site that official classification had described as natural stone scatter. This is the kind of evidence that, in another context, another continent, another landscape that had been predefined as architecturally complex by its first European observers, would have prompted immediate and intensive investigation. In Australia, it prompted nothing further. The individuals who found it were not in a position to compel official response. They documented what they could with the equipment available to them. They shared their findings with each other through the informal networks of those interested in Australian ancient history, and they watched the site continue to erode and to be disturbed by grazing animals and the slow creep of vegetation. This is not an isolated story. It is the story of dozens of sites across the continent, documented inadequately by people without institutional resources, dismissed or deferred by institutions without adequate resources, or without the appetite for the implications of what a thorough examination might reveal. And the implications are significant. Let me be clear about exactly what they are. If the sites I have been describing represent what their most serious investigators believe they represent, then Australia was home, at some point in the deep past, to social groups that were not simply moving across the landscape in small mobile bands. They were organizing themselves to undertake large-scale construction projects. They were managing the landscape's water resources with engineering precision. They were creating permanent or semi-permanent settlements substantial enough to leave traces in the earth that persist today. And they were doing all of this at a time that the conventional model places them firmly in the category of pre-architectural nomads. This is not a minor revision. This is a fundamental rethinking of what happened on this continent and of what human beings were capable of at the kinds of timescales involved. Now let us move to an even more uncomfortable body of evidence. Because everything I have described so far is, in one sense, consistent with an advanced hunter-gatherer society. A society that builds aquaculture systems and stone settlements and astronomical monuments, but that has not yet developed agriculture or metallurgy or the other markers that Western historical tradition uses to define civilization. And that framing, however much it might require adjustment of our understanding, still fits within a recognizable category. Advanced foragers, complex semi-nomads, people who were more sophisticated than we assumed, but who were sophisticated in directions that we can map onto existing models. The next body of evidence does not fit as comfortably. There are, in several locations across Australia, stone structures that do not look like anything in the Indigenous Australian tradition, as we currently understand it. They do not resemble stone arrangements made for ceremony. They do not resemble aquaculture engineering. They do not resemble the astronomical alignments or the territorial markers or the navigational cairns that form the known vocabulary of Aboriginal stoneworking. They resemble, instead, the architecture of somewhere else. Let me describe the most striking example carefully because I want to convey exactly what makes it so difficult to dismiss. On the Gulf of Carpentaria coast, in far northern Australia, there are stone platforms and wall complexes that have been examined by a small number of researchers over the past several decades. The platforms are substantial, ranging from a few meters to several tens of meters on a side, and they are built from stone that had to be carried to the location because the underlying geology in the immediate area does not produce stone of the type used. Carrying stone in significant quantity to a specific location for construction purposes is not casual behavior. It is planned, organized, purposeful work requiring not just the physical effort of transport but the prior conception of what the stone is needed for. The wall complexes associated with these platforms show jointing techniques. The stones are fitted to each other with a precision that reduces gaps and creates a more stable structure than random stacking would produce. The fitting is not the precision of Egyptian pyramid construction, but it is not random either. It is the work of people who understood how stones could be made to support each other, who had developed or inherited knowledge of load-bearing masonry. And the orientation of several of these structures suggests a relationship to the sea and to the navigation of the sea. They are positioned to provide unobstructed views across the water. They are located at points on the coast where the prevailing currents and wind patterns would make them natural stopping points for maritime travelers. And they bear a resemblance, noted independently by several researchers who had no knowledge of each other's work, to certain coastal structures in island Southeast Asia that have been tentatively dated to the period before the modern sea levels were established. The period before modern sea levels were established. That phrase requires unpacking because it is crucial to understanding the full strangeness of what we are discussing. Between approximately 20,000 years ago and about 8,000 years ago, sea levels across the world rose by approximately 120 meters. This rise was not a smooth, gradual process. It occurred in pulses, some of them dramatic, as ice sheets in the northern hemisphere destabilized and collapsed into the ocean. The coastlines of the world were transformed. What had been coastal lowlands and continental shelves became seafloor. Rivers that had flowed into the distant ocean across wide plains now emptied into water that was suddenly much closer. Harbors, anchorages, and coastal settlements that had existed for thousands of years were submerged. In Australia, the effect was particularly dramatic. The continent that existed 20,000 years ago was substantially larger than the Australia of today. The northern coast extended further toward what is now the Indonesian archipelago. The western coast stretched out across what is now the Indian Ocean. The southern coast reached across a landmass connecting what is now mainland Australia to Tasmania, a landmass that included a large lake system now lost beneath the Bass Strait. And the northwestern coast, including the area around the Gulf of Carpentaria and the shallow Timor Sea, was a broad, well-watered lowland with river systems that would have supported significant human populations. All of that is now underwater. And whatever structures, whatever settlements, whatever evidence of human activity existed on those lowlands is now resting on the seafloor, covered by the sediment of 8 to 12,000 years of ocean accumulation. It is, for practical purposes, inaccessible. The technology to systematically survey the continental shelves of Australia in the way that terrestrial sites can be surveyed does not yet exist at the scale that would be required. And the funding to develop such technology for this purpose is not currently available. So we are left with the coastline as it exists today, with the platforms and walls built on what is now the modern shore. And with the question of whether those structures are the uppermost remnants of a much more extensive coastal civilization, the parts that happen to be above the waterline when the sea stopped rising, and that have therefore survived to be examined. This is not a fringe hypothesis. It is the logical extension of what we know about sea level rise and its effects on coastal populations. The archaeologists who study the underwater prehistory of other continents, those who examine the submerged landscapes of the North Sea, the Persian Gulf, the coasts of India and Southeast Asia, routinely work on the assumption that significant human activity occurred in areas now underwater, and that the evidence of that activity, if it can be reached and examined, will tell us things about the deep human past that the surviving land record does not. Australia's submerged shelves deserve the same attention and have received almost none of it. What we can work with is inference. If significant human populations lived on Australia's coastal lowlands before the seas rose, and the population genetics and the evidence of continuous occupation suggest they did, then those populations were not living in primitive isolation. They were adjacent to the land bridges and the island chains that connected Australia to the rest of the human world. They were in a position to develop maritime technology, to trade, to communicate, to share knowledge with the populations of what is now Indonesia and the Philippines and Papua New Guinea. They were, in other words, participants in a broader human story, not isolated relics. And the structures on the current coastline, the ones we can examine today, may reflect that participation, may be the markers of a maritime civilization whose main territory is now beneath the ocean. Now we move deeper still into the territory of things that cannot be comfortably explained. There is a site in the Pilbara region of Western Australia that has been known to local Aboriginal communities for generations, and that came to wider attention in the 20th century through a series of encounters that none of the people involved seemed to know what to do with. The Pilbara is one of the oldest landscapes on Earth. The rocks here are some of the most ancient exposed rock on the planet, formed billions of years ago. The landscape has a quality of timelessness that even casual visitors remark upon. It is a place where the ordinary sense of human scale seems to shift, where the distances are too large and the silence is too complete for modern habits of perception to work properly. In a specific area of the Pilbara that I will again describe only generally, out of respect for the sensitivities involved, there are rock engravings, petroglyphs, that have been the subject of considerable debate since their formal documentation in the 20th century. The debate is not about whether they exist or whether they are ancient. They clearly exist, and the patination of the rock surface around them indicates that they are very old, perhaps among the oldest rock art in the world. The debate is about what they show. Some of them are recognizable: animals, human figures, geometric patterns, the kinds of images found in ancient rock art traditions around the world. But others are not recognizable in any straightforward way. There are images that, when examined without prior assumption, appear to show things that should not be possible in the context of a prehistoric Australian tradition. There are what appear to be structures, not natural landscape features, not abstract symbols, but representations of built forms, towers, enclosed spaces, objects of a kind that the people who first made systematic records of these images struggled to categorize. There are also images that have been described, by people who have spent time with them, as depicting things that could be interpreted as celestial phenomena. Not just the sun and moon, which appear in rock art globally, but what seem to be organized depictions of star fields, arrangements of points that, when their positions are carefully mapped, correspond to the positions of stars as they appeared in the southern sky at specific times of year. If that interpretation is correct, and it is contested, then the people who made these images were systematic astronomers. They were recording the sky not in the way that a person records a beautiful sunset, but in the way that a person records data. They were making a map. Astronomical knowledge at that level of precision requires multi-generational observation and recording. You cannot identify the positions of specific stars and their annual patterns in a single lifetime. You need records. You need a way of passing observations from one generation to the next that is accurate enough to preserve the specific positional data rather than just the general observation that stars move in the sky. You need, in some form, a system of knowledge transmission that is more precise than ordinary oral tradition can generally sustain. This brings us to one of the most intriguing and most underexplored aspects of Australian ancient knowledge: the question of what the Aboriginal astronomical tradition actually contains, and how old it is. What is known about Aboriginal astronomy is extraordinary, even by the conservative accounts of Western researchers who have studied it. The Aboriginal peoples of Australia have the oldest continuous astronomical tradition in the world. Their knowledge of the night sky is not just observational, but systematic. Different communities across the continent maintain detailed knowledge of the movements of stars, planets, and the moon, correlated with seasonal events on the ground, the flowering of specific plants, the appearance of specific animals, the timing of rainfall and flood. This is not folk astronomy. It is a sophisticated knowledge system that functions as a seasonal calendar of extraordinary precision. Some researchers have argued that specific elements of this knowledge tradition can be shown to be at least 10,000 years old, because they include accurate description of astronomical events that could only have been observed at dates that far back or further. The precession of the equinoxes, the slow wobble of the Earth's axis that changes the apparent positions of the stars over thousands of years, means that the star positions described in certain traditional accounts match the sky as it appeared not at the present time, but at a much more ancient epoch. If those traditions are accurately preserving observations from that epoch, then the knowledge embedded in them is older than any written astronomical record anywhere in the world, older than Babylonian astronomy, older than Egyptian astronomy, older than the astronomical traditions of any civilization that built in stone and wrote its observations down. This raises a question that is, in the end, the central question of everything we are discussing tonight. If the knowledge is that old, what was the knowledge for? What were people doing with astronomical precision of that degree, at that depth of time, in this landscape? The straightforward answer, and it is a real answer, is that astronomical knowledge is useful for navigation, for seasonal planning, for the coordination of gatherings and ceremonies across large distances. These are things that a mobile population in a large landscape genuinely needed. Knowing when the rains were coming, when certain plants would be ready to harvest, when fish would be running in certain waterways, these are matters of survival. A precise astronomical calendar serves all of those needs, but there is another answer, or rather, another layer to the same answer. Astronomical knowledge at the level of precision we are describing, maintained over the kind of timescales we are describing, implies a social organization capable of sustaining that knowledge across generations. It implies institutions, not necessarily institutions in the formal sense that the word calls to mind, buildings and offices and titles, but institutions in the sense of organized, stable, perpetuating structures of knowledge preservation and transmission. Systems that ensure that what was observed 10,000 years ago or 20,000 years ago is still accurately known today. The existence of such institutions is itself evidence of a social complexity that goes beyond what the standard model of small, mobile, hunter-gatherer bands would predict. Institutions that can maintain precise astronomical data across 10,000 years are not maintained by people who move constantly and live in small groups with no formal structure of knowledge authority. They are maintained by people who have developed exactly that kind of formal structure, who have assigned to specific individuals the role of keeper of knowledge, who have created mechanisms for ensuring accuracy and for detecting and correcting error. And if those institutions existed, then the people who maintained them were not simply living the life of nomadic foragers who happened to have good memories. They were members of a civilization. Not civilization in the European sense, not civilization with cities and written language and metallurgy, but civilization in the older, deeper sense of the word. A society organized for purposes beyond immediate survival. A society that had made decisions about how knowledge would be held, how it would be transmitted, how it would be used. A society with a history and an understanding of that history that extended back further than our own recorded past. This is the thing that Australian ancient history, when examined honestly, forces us to confront. The possibility that the category of civilization is both smaller and larger than we have assumed it to be. Smaller, in the sense that it does not require all of the specific markers that Western historical tradition has associated with it. No cities required, no writing required, no metal required. And larger, in the sense that it can encompass modes of organization, kinds of knowledge, and scales of time that the Western tradition has not previously been willing to include within its definition. Let me turn now to a specific category of evidence that has been the subject of particularly intense debate and particularly consistent official dismissal: the question of ancient contact. Australia is an island continent. It has been separated from the rest of the world's landmasses by ocean for tens of millions of years. The human beings who arrived on it arrived by sea. They must have. There was no land connection. And the fact that they arrived 65,000 years ago, when sea levels were lower but the ocean crossings were still significant, tells us something important about the maritime capability of the people who made that journey. They could navigate open water. They had watercraft capable of carrying people and their possessions across distances of at least 70 or 80 kilometers of open ocean, and possibly more. That capability did not disappear after arrival. It may have developed further. The maritime traditions of Aboriginal Australian peoples are not, in the surviving record, as elaborate as those of Polynesia or Melanesia. But the surviving record is exactly that, surviving. It represents what was present at the moment of European encounter, in communities that had been shaped by 60,000 years of separation from the broader maritime world. It does not tell us what was present 10,000 years ago, or 20,000 years ago, or 50,000 years ago. And there is evidence, provocative and contested, that Australia was not as isolated across those vast stretches of time as the standard model assumes. Consider the genetic evidence. Population genetics is a young field, and its findings are regularly revised as more data becomes available and as methods improve. But certain findings have been persistent enough and consistent enough across multiple independent studies to demand attention. There are genetic signatures in certain Aboriginal Australian populations that suggest connections at very deep time to populations in India and in southern Africa. These connections predate the period that historical models would use to explain them. They are not the result of colonial-era migration. They suggest that the ancestral populations of Australia were, at some point in the very deep past, in contact with populations elsewhere in the world in ways that we do not yet have a detailed account of. There is also the biological evidence of the dingo. The dingo is not native to Australia in the way that the kangaroo and the koala are native. It is a dog, and dogs are domesticated animals. They cannot exist without human beings. The dingo arrived in Australia approximately 3,500 to 4,000 years ago, and it arrived from Southeast Asia. Its presence in Australia is direct evidence of maritime contact between Australia and Asia at that date. People brought the dingo. That means boats capable of carrying animals. That means contact maintained across the open ocean at a technological level sufficient for that kind of transport. 3,500 years ago. Not in the distant haze of the oldest Australian prehistory, but at a point when Australia already had 60,000 years of continuous human occupation behind it. At a point when Egypt had already built its pyramids and the Mediterranean civilizations were in full flower. Contact, maritime contact, organized enough to transport domestic animals, was happening in Australia at the same time that the Bronze Age was transforming the rest of the world. And if that contact existed at that date, what existed at earlier dates? The dingo is simply the biological marker that happened to survive and to be identifiable. What other contacts, what other exchanges, what other connections existed and left no surviving trace because the things exchanged were perishable, or because the evidence is now underwater, or because we have not yet looked carefully enough at what the landscape itself records? There is one more category of evidence that I want to discuss, and it is perhaps the most speculative of everything we have covered tonight, but it is also, in some ways, the most important. Because it concerns not specific sites or specific objects, but the overall pattern of the Australian landscape considered as a human creation. The land itself. One of the most significant developments in our understanding of the Aboriginal relationship with the Australian landscape has been the growing recognition of the role of fire in shaping that landscape. The Aboriginal peoples of Australia practiced systematic, controlled burning of the landscape for an extraordinarily long time. Not casual burning, not accidental burning, systematic, seasonal, deliberately managed burning, using fire to manipulate the mosaic of vegetation types across the landscape in ways that promoted the growth of food plants, maintained the health of grasslands, encouraged the concentrations of animals in specific areas, and reduced the risk of catastrophic, uncontrolled fire. This practice, which is now being restored in various parts of Australia as a conservation strategy, transformed the Australian landscape. The composition of the vegetation, the distribution of plant species, the structure of the ecosystems, all of these were shaped by tens of thousands of years of deliberate human management. The Australia that European settlers encountered in the late 18th century was not a wilderness. It was a garden, an enormous garden, managed at continental scale, shaped by human intention across geological time. That understanding is now fairly well established in academic literature, though it has not yet fully permeated public consciousness. But it raises a question that the academic literature has been slower to ask. If the management of the landscape was this systematic, this sustained, this deliberate, what else was being managed in ways that we have not yet recognized? Fire, after all, is one tool. It is a powerful tool, transforming vegetation at landscape scale, but it is one tool. A society capable of deploying fire systematically across a continent for tens of thousands of years was not a society at the limits of its managerial capability. It was a society in the middle of its capability. What else was it doing? Water management, as we have discussed, stone construction, as we have discussed, astronomical observation and knowledge transmission, as we have discussed. But perhaps also something harder to see from the outside. Perhaps the management of human movement itself. The distribution of people across the landscape in patterns that reflected ecological knowledge, that avoided the concentration of population in areas that could not support it, and that directed population toward areas where it could flourish without exhausting resources. The maintenance of territorial boundaries, not through force, but through social understanding. The coordination of large-scale gatherings at specific times and places that served not just ceremonial purposes but logistical ones. The exchange of genetic material, the sharing of knowledge, the resolution of conflicts, the redistribution of surplus. This is, in the technical language of systems theory, a distributed network. Not a centralized civilization with a capital and a hierarchy and a bureaucracy. A distributed network of communities connected by kinship, by ceremonial obligation, by the exchange of objects and knowledge, by shared astronomical understanding, by the management of shared resources. A network that extended across an entire continent and that was maintained, with remarkable stability, for longer than any other human social system we are aware of. Is this a civilization? By most definitions, it does not qualify. It does not have cities. It does not have writing. It does not have the monumental architecture that the Western tradition uses as its primary marker of civilizational achievement. But by another definition, perhaps by a better definition, it is something more remarkable than most civilizations. It is a system of human organization that achieved extraordinary stability across extraordinary timescales without depleting the resource base that supported it. A system that maintained sophisticated knowledge traditions across thousands of generations without the external storage media of writing. A system that coordinated human activity across a continent without centralized administration. A system that built when building was needed, managed when management was possible, and moved when movement was better than either. And it left marks. Not the marks that we have been trained to look for, not the towering ziggurats of Mesopotamia or the colonnaded temples of Greece or the great walls of China, but marks nonetheless, in the earth, in the stone, in the sky knowledge, in the water systems, in the genetic record of the people who carry this history in their bodies. Those marks are what we have been exploring tonight, and they are real. They are there, and they are waiting for the kind of sustained, funded, collaborative, and genuinely open-minded investigation that they have never yet received. Let me now take you somewhere specific, a place that I think captures, in one location, the full scope of what I have been describing. The Lake Eyre Basin, now known formally as the Carty-Thander Lake Eyre Basin, is the heart of Australia. It sits in the dead center of the continent, and it is the terminus of the largest internal drainage system in the world. Rivers that begin in the highlands of Queensland and New South Wales flow inward, toward the desert, losing water to evaporation and absorption as they go, and what eventually reaches the lake, which happens only rarely in any given year, is a shallow, salt-laden sheet of water that covers the vast white pan of the lake bed before evaporating away. To modernize, this is extreme desolation. The lake bed in dry conditions is an almost lunar landscape, blinding white salt extending to the horizon, broken only by mirages and the occasional outcrop of dark rock. The surrounding desert is among the harshest in the world. It is almost incomprehensible that significant human populations ever lived here. But in the past, this landscape was different. The channels that feed Lake Eyre, the Cooper Creek, the Diamantina, the Georgina, and their tributaries, flowed more strongly and more reliably in wetter climatic periods. The lake itself filled more often and to greater depth. The surrounding country, which today supports only the most sparse and specialized desert vegetation, carried grasses and trees and the animals that fed on them. And the channels themselves, in flood, created vast temporary wetlands, shallow lagoon systems, areas of extraordinary biological productivity that would have supported very large numbers of people. We know from multiple lines of evidence that this landscape supported significant human populations during the wetter periods. There are archaeological sites around the margins of the channels and the lake that document continuous occupation. There are middens, places where food remains accumulated over long periods of habitation. There are grinding stones, used to process seeds into flour, found in concentrations that suggest not occasional camps but extended settlement. And there are, in the Channel Country and on the elevated ground overlooking the lake basin, stone features that resist easy explanation. The most striking of these features are what some researchers have called the stone circles of the Channel Country. They are, as the name suggests, circular arrangements of stone, but the name does not do justice to their variety and complexity. There are simple rings, single courses of stone forming rough circles a few meters in diameter. There are more complex arrangements with internal features, subdivisions of the circle into smaller spaces, central hearths or platforms. And there are, in a handful of locations, very large arrangements, circles or partial circles of stone that extend for tens of meters, that show evidence of deliberate construction rather than casual placement, and that are situated in positions that relate to specific landscape features, specific directions, specific astronomical alignments. Some of these larger arrangements have been examined closely enough to determine that the stones forming them were not gathered from the immediate vicinity. The stone was carried, sometimes from sources several kilometers away, which implies that the construction was planned with a specific outcome in mind, that the builders knew what they needed before they began, and that they were organized enough to supply the material. This is not what casual, opportunistic construction looks like. This is what intentional architecture looks like. Who built them? When? For what purpose? The honest answer is that we do not know. And the frustrating answer is that we have not tried hard enough to find out. The Channel Country is remote. Access is difficult. The populations of Aboriginal peoples who maintain knowledge of the landscape were severely disrupted by the pastoral expansion of the 19th century, which displaced communities from their country, broke the continuity of knowledge transmission, and in many cases resulted in the deaths of the knowledge holders before what they carried could be adequately recorded. What survives in community memory is fragmentary. Some knowledge holders have shared their understanding that certain stone arrangements are ceremonial. Others describe them as markers of boundary and territory. But the specific knowledge of construction, of the reason for the specific placement, of the astronomical or cosmological framework within which they were built, has in many cases been lost or is held by specific individuals within specific communities in ways that are not accessible to outside inquiry. This is, in itself, a tragedy. Not a historical tragedy in the distant sense, but an ongoing one. The knowledge that could most help us understand these structures is held by descendants of the builders, and those descendants have been systematically prevented by the history of colonialism and its aftermath from exercising the custodianship of their ancestral knowledge in the ways that would best preserve it. The disruption of culture is a disruption of archaeology. The loss of language is the loss of explanatory record. The destruction of community continuity is the destruction of living knowledge that cannot be reconstructed from stone and sediment alone. This is why any serious engagement with Australian ancient history must include, not merely acknowledge, but actually include, the voices and the authority of Aboriginal communities. Not as a political courtesy, but as an epistemic necessity. The knowledge that can make sense of the landscape evidence exists, partially, in living memory. It is urgent that it be recorded, that it be respected, and that the people who hold it be given the resources and the autonomy to determine how it is shared and with whom. This is not in conflict with archaeological investigation. It is, or should be, the foundation of it. Let us step back now from specific sites and specific debates and try to assemble from everything we have discussed a larger picture. A picture of what Australian ancient history might actually look like when examined without the filtering assumptions that have distorted our view of it. Here is what the evidence, taken as a whole, suggests. 65,000 years ago, probably more, the first human beings arrived in Australia. They came by sea. The journey required watercraft and navigational knowledge. They were not, therefore, simple wanderers who happened to reach a new shore. They were maritime people, capable of intentional ocean crossing. Over the tens of thousands of years that followed, these people and their descendants spread across the continent and developed a relationship with the landscape that was active rather than passive. They used fire to manage vegetation at continental scale. They built aquaculture systems to manage food production. They organized themselves into networks of communities connected by ceremonial obligation and by kinship. networks that extended across the entire continent and that maintained stable social and ecological relationships across timescales that dwarf any other human social system in the historical record. In certain regions and at certain periods, the complexity of this organization expressed itself in ways that left structural traces, stone arrangements, some of them large and some of them architecturally sophisticated by the standards of their time. Hydraulic engineering, sophisticated enough to have supported significant settled or semi-settled populations. Coastal structures, probably the visible remnants of a maritime civilization whose main territory is now underwater, submerged by the sea level rise of 8 to 12,000 years ago. This civilization, and I will use that word now without apology, maintained an astronomical knowledge tradition of extraordinary precision that preserved observational data across timescales greater than any written record anywhere in the world. It maintained this tradition through institutions of knowledge transmission whose stability and accuracy exceeded anything that the Western tradition has previously considered possible in the absence of writing. It was in contact, at various periods, with populations in Southeast Asia, India, and possibly further afield. Those contacts left traces in genetics, in biology, and in the hints of structural influence that appear in certain coastal sites. The contacts were maritime. They required vessels and navigational knowledge. They were not accidental. And then, beginning approximately 12,000 years ago, with the final episode of major sea level rise, and continuing through the gradual desiccation of the interior that reduced the productivity of the channel country and the inland lake systems, the conditions that had supported the greatest complexity of this civilization changed. The coastal lowlands went underwater. The inland waterways shrank. The populations that had been supported by the rich aquatic resources of these areas contracted and dispersed. What survived was adapted to what remained. The land-based knowledge traditions, the astronomical systems, the ceremonial networks, the fire management practices, the physical infrastructure, the stone structures and the hydraulic systems were largely abandoned or maintained at reduced scale and then eroded and obscured across the subsequent millennia until what remains today is fragmentary and hard to read. This is not a story of decline from some golden age of civilization. It is a story of adaptation to changing conditions, the same kind of adaptation that has characterized the human response to environmental change everywhere and always. The knowledge was not lost, it was transformed. It survived, embedded in the living traditions of Aboriginal communities, encoded in ceremony and language and landscape practice, across all the subsequent millennia. It is still there, diminished by colonial disruption, but still there. And the physical traces are still there too, in the stone of the interior, in the channels cut through rock, in the remnants of walls and platforms on the coastline, waiting, as they have waited for thousands of years, for the investigation that would make sense of them. That investigation has barely begun. Now I want to turn to a different kind of evidence. Something that has been even more contentious than anything I have discussed so far, and that requires even more careful examination. The question of whether the ancient history of Australia is connected in ways that our conventional understanding does not admit to the ancient history of the Americas. I can hear the skepticism in the air. The connection between Australia and the Americas is not something that appears in any mainstream account of either continent's prehistory. The Americas were populated from Asia via the Bering Land Bridge or along the Pacific coast tens of thousands of years ago. Australia was populated from Southeast Asia via island chains and sea crossings. The two continents are on opposite sides of the Pacific Ocean, separated by more water than any other two inhabited landmasses on Earth. And yet, there is a genetic signal, identified in studies published in peer-reviewed journals, that suggests a connection between certain Aboriginal Australian populations and certain Amazonian populations in South America. The signal is not large. It is not the dominant element in either population's genetic profile. But it is there, it is consistent across independent studies, and it cannot be explained by any conventional model of migration or contact. Let me be precise about what this signal means and what it does not mean. It does not mean that Aboriginal Australians travelled to South America or that South Americans travelled to Australia. It does not mean that there was a direct connection between the two populations at any recent date. What it most likely means is that the ancestral populations of both groups shared common ancestors at a deep time, and that those common ancestors maintained connections, whether through the movement of people or the movement of genes, across a geographic span that our conventional models say should have been impassable. The Pacific Ocean was impassable, except that it was not quite. The Polynesian peoples crossed it repeatedly, in both directions, using navigational knowledge and vessel technology that the Western world did not match until the early modern period. And the Polynesian expansion happened in the relatively recent past, within the last 3,000 years. Before that, the Pacific was not regularly crossed. But before that, at much deeper times, the Pacific was not the Pacific as it is now. Sea levels were lower. Island chains that are now submerged were exposed. The stepping stones across the ocean were more numerous and closer together. It is not impossible that at some point in the very deep past, populations that we would now place in the Australia-Pacific region reached the Americas. It is not even particularly far-fetched, given what we know about the maritime capability of the people who crossed to Australia in the first place. And if they did reach the Americas, or if some genetic lineage managed to cross the Pacific in either direction, it would explain the signal that population geneticists have found. But explaining the signal is not the same as understanding its significance. And its significance, if the connection is real, is that the deep human past is more connected than we have assumed. That the great ocean, which we think of as a barrier, was, at some points and for some populations, something else, a highway, a medium of connection rather than of separation, a space in which human beings moved and exchanged and connected across distances that seem to us, from the perspective of modern geography, almost impossibly vast. This is the context in which I want to examine some specific evidence from the coasts of Australia and from certain interior sites that suggests, to some investigators, a connection to cultures that we associate with the Americas. There are rock engravings in the Pilbara region of Western Australia that have been compared by independent researchers working on different continents to petroglyphs found in specific locations in North and South America. The comparison is not based on superficial resemblance. It is based on specific formal similarities, the repetition of particular symbolic combinations, particular compositional strategies, particular geometric relationships within individual images that appear in both locations, and that do not appear in the general global inventory of rock art in the same combination. These similarities have been documented and published, though in venues that the mainstream archaeological community has not felt compelled to engage with. The interpretation is contested. Cross-cultural similarities in art can arise independently. The human mind has a limited repertoire of geometric forms and a consistent set of perceptual tendencies that can produce similar imagery in unconnected traditions. The skeptical position is that the similarities between Australian and American petroglyphs are coincidence or convergence, not evidence of contact. But the similarities are specific enough and their distribution is unusual enough that coincidence is not the most parsimonious explanation. The images that appear in both places are not just circles and lines. They include specific complex arrangements, specific symbolic vocabularies, specific spatial relationships that require either contact, common origin, or an extraordinarily improbable independent coincidence. And there is a further complication. Some of the American petroglyphs that bear these similarities are in locations that, by the current conventional model, should not have been influenced by Pacific or Australian connections. They are in inland North America, in the American Southwest, in regions that are usually understood as having been settled from Asia via the Bering Connection with no Pacific maritime component, and yet the similarities persist. What does this mean? I do not want to overstate the case. The evidence is suggestive, not conclusive. The connections, if they exist, are ancient and indirect, not recent and literal. But they point toward a picture of the deep human past in which movement and connection across what seemed to us like impossible distances were part of the normal history of our species. Before farming, before writing, before civilization as we have defined it, people were moving, people were connecting. People were carrying knowledge and culture and genetic material across the world in ways that leave traces we are only beginning to learn to read. And Australia, which we have treated as the isolated endpoint of a one-way migration, may have been not an endpoint at all, but a hub, a node in a network of human connection that extended at its furthest reach across the Pacific and into the Americas, and that maintained that connection, however intermittently and however indirectly, across stretches of time that we have barely begun to comprehend. Let me stay for a moment with that word, hub, because it changes the picture significantly. If Australia was a hub, then what we see in the archaeological record is not the gradual, isolated development of a single population in a single landscape. It is the local expression of something larger, the specific genius of Aboriginal Australian culture, the fire management, the astronomical knowledge, the distributed network of ceremonial and kin relationships, the aquacultural engineering. These did not arise in a vacuum. They arose in a context of human history that was richer, more connected, and more complex than our conventional models allow. The specific achievements of the Aboriginal Australian tradition are extraordinary on their own terms. But if they were also connected to a broader network of human capability and exchange, they become more extraordinary still. Because they represent not just one people's response to one landscape, but one people's contribution to a shared human project that extended across the planet. This is, perhaps, the deepest revision that the evidence of Australian ancient history demands. Not just the revision of the Australian timeline, not just the extension of the Australian record backward into a depth of time that our models have not previously accommodated, but the revision of our entire picture of the deep human past, the recognition that the human story from its earliest chapters has been a story of connection as much as of isolation, of movement as much as of settlement, of exchange as much as of independent development. We are, all of us, connected to Australia's ancient past. Not because of some mystical solidarity, but because the human past is one past, not many. The people who managed fire across the Australian continent 60,000 years ago, the people who built aquaculture systems at the edge of the inland sea, the people who recorded the stars with a precision that would not be matched in the written astronomical traditions for tens of thousands of years, these people were our ancestors in the deepest sense. Not our ancestors because of a specific genetic line, though many of us may share more with them genetically than the standard model acknowledges. Our ancestors in the sense that they were participants in the same human story that we are still telling. The same story of curiosity and survival and adaptation and, in the deepest and most important sense, civilization. Now let me take you to a specific class of evidence that has been discussed in various forms for decades, but that has never received the thorough, systematic, funded investigation it deserves. The question of ancient underground systems. There are, across the Australian continent, accounts and some evidence of underground spaces that do not fit the known geology of the areas in question. Not the natural cave systems of the limestone karst country, which are well known and extensively documented. Not the lava tubes of volcanic regions, which are also well understood. But other underground spaces in regions where the geology does not obviously produce caves, that seem to have been worked, that have the marks of tools on their walls, and that in some cases lead to water sources that should not be accessible from the surface. This is sensitive territory for several reasons. The accounts are largely anecdotal, coming from pastoralists and explorers, rather than from trained geologists or archaeologists. Some of them date from the 19th or early 20th century, and cannot now be followed up because the people who made them are dead, and the exact locations they described were often inadequately specified. And some of the accounts come from Aboriginal communities who hold the underground as sacred and who are understandably reluctant to have it investigated by outsiders. But the accounts share features that make them difficult to dismiss entirely. In multiple independent descriptions, from widely separated regions and from observers with no apparent reason to fabricate or embellish, there are recurring themes. Underground passages that are clearly worked, not natural. The presence of water at depth in locations where the surface geology should not support it. and the specific observation, made by multiple independent parties, of a quality of the worked stone that suggests not casual pecking but systematic carving, the kind of sustained, purposeful stone working that in other contexts would be recognized as mining or tunneling. What were they tunneling for? There are, in the geological record of Australia, mineral deposits of various kinds. The continent is among the richest in the world for certain mineral resources, and the surface expressions of some of those deposits would have been visible to careful observers of the landscape. Aboriginal communities had knowledge of and made use of various minerals for practical and ceremonial purposes, red and yellow ochre most prominently, but also stone types valued for their properties in tool-making. But the accounts of underground working do not universally suggest mineral extraction. Some describe passages that seem to lead to water, suggesting a different purpose. And some describe spaces that are too large and too architecturally elaborate to be the result of simple resource extraction. Chambers, rooms, spaces that, by the descriptions available, seem to have been intended for habitation or for ceremony, rather than for removal of material. This places them in a different category. Not mines, but structures. Not extraction, but construction underground. Why build underground? In the landscape of interior Australia, the answer is straightforward. The climate, the Australian interior, is hostile to surface habitation for much of the year. Summer temperatures are lethal. Water is scarce. The surface offers little shade and no relief from the heat. Underground spaces, by contrast, maintain a relatively stable temperature far below the surface extremes. They require no additional fuel to remain habitable. They provide shelter from the wind and from the predators that move at night. And they are, importantly, associated with water. In arid landscapes, water follows underground pathways, and the people with the best access to groundwater are the people who survive. The Coober Pedy opal mining town in South Australia is famous for its underground homes, built by 20th century residents who discovered that the most comfortable way to live in the extreme heat of the region is to live below it. What those modern residents did with 20th century machinery and engineering knowledge, people living in the same landscape 60,000 years ago may have discovered through much older means and practiced for much longer and at much greater scale. The underground spaces of Australia may be among its most significant and least investigated ancient features. They are hard to find, hard to document, sensitive in terms of both cultural ownership and physical safety, and situated in remote regions that are expensive and difficult to access. None of these obstacles is insuperable. All of them have contributed to the fact that systematic investigation has not occurred. Let me now address something that I have been circling around throughout this discussion. The question of why. Not why the megastructures were built, or why the aquaculture systems were engineered, or why the stone arrangements were laid out in their precise configurations. But why, given that these things exist, and given that the evidence for their existence is available, has the investigation been so limited? Why has the mainstream of Australian archaeology been so slow to pursue these questions with the urgency they seem to demand? I offered some explanations earlier. Underfunding, understaffing, the weight of prior assumption, the filtering effect of established paradigms. These are all real factors, and they are genuinely important. But there is another factor that is harder to name and harder to address: the politics of ancient history. Ancient history is not neutral. The question of who was here first and how they lived and what they built is not simply a matter of academic interest. It has direct implications for questions of sovereignty, of land ownership, of the moral account that settler colonial societies must make to themselves about what was done to the peoples who were already here. In Australia, those implications are particularly charged because the history of dispossession, of the policies that remove children from families and people from land, of the legal fiction of terra nullius that declared the continent empty and unowned at the moment of European arrival, is recent. Its effects are present. The wounds are not healed. In that context, evidence that the Aboriginal peoples of Australia built at landscape scale, managed continent-wide ecological systems, maintained knowledge traditions of extraordinary sophistication across timescales that dwarf the entire history of Western civilization, is not merely interesting. It is politically and morally significant. It provides a specific and detailed basis for understanding the scale of what was lost and the scale of what was taken. For some people in positions of cultural and institutional authority, that is precisely why such evidence should not be too energetically pursued. The more clearly the depth and complexity of Aboriginal Australian civilization is established, the more directly it challenges the narratives that have been used to justify and to minimize the historical record of colonization. Not everyone who has been slow to investigate Australian ancient history has been consciously motivated by this consideration. Paradigm inertia and resource constraints are real. But the pattern of consistent underinvestigation in a country with the resources to investigate, the consistent dismissal of anomalous evidence, the consistent preference for simple explanations over complex ones, has a political dimension that cannot be entirely separated from the epistemic one. This is not unique to Australia. The same pattern appears in the archaeology of the Americas, where evidence of pre-Columbian civilizations of extraordinary sophistication has been consistently underestimated, incompletely investigated, and, in some cases, actively misrepresented by researchers working within colonial institutions that had reasons to prefer simpler stories. The same pattern appears in the archaeology of Africa, where the sophistication of pre-colonial African civilizations was systematically denied and minimized by researchers whose assumptions about what was possible in that context were shaped by racial ideology rather than evidence. The same pattern appears wherever the archaeology of a colonized people is conducted, primarily by the institutions of the colonizers. The good news is that this is changing. Slowly, inconsistently, against resistance, but changing. The recognition of Bujbim as a World Heritage Site was one marker of that change. The increasing involvement of Aboriginal communities in the management and interpretation of archaeological evidence on their own country is another. The growing body of work by Indigenous researchers and scholars who are bringing both their own knowledge traditions and the tools of Western academia to bear on these questions represents another, and perhaps the most important, shift. The picture that is emerging from that shift is exactly the picture that the evidence, honestly examined, has always pointed toward. A deep, complex, sophisticated human history in Australia, one that exceeds anything that the previous consensus was willing to acknowledge, and one that connects to the broader human story in ways that are only beginning to be traced. We are at the beginning of understanding Australia's ancient past. Not the end, not even the middle. The beginning. And what the beginning reveals is extraordinary enough that the middle and the end promise to be among the most significant chapters in the story of human history. Now I want to shift in a different direction, away from specific physical evidence and towards something more elusive but perhaps more fundamental. The question of what the people who built these structures and maintained these systems believed about the world they lived in and about their place within it. This is not a question that archaeology can answer directly. Material evidence tells us what people did. It is a much more difficult and uncertain project to recover from material evidence what people thought and felt and believed. But in Australia, there is a resource that is not available for most ancient civilizations, because most ancient civilizations are truly gone. Their living descendants, if they exist, have been so transformed by the passage of time and the influence of subsequent cultures that the thread connecting them to their deep past is barely traceable. In Australia, the thread is damaged but not broken. The living traditions of Aboriginal communities, despite the disruption of colonialism, despite the loss of specific knowledge in specific places, still carry elements that connect to the deep past. The astronomical knowledge we have discussed, the ecological knowledge encoded in ceremony and practice, the understanding of the landscape as a living system, as a network of relationships between human beings and the other beings, plant and animal and spiritual, with whom they share the country. And embedded in those traditions is a cosmological framework that, when examined carefully, reveals a relationship to time and to history that is radically different from the one that shapes Western culture. The Western tradition thinks of time as linear. It moves from a beginning, through a middle, toward an end. History is the story of progress, of development, of accumulation. The past is behind us, receding, increasingly distant. The future is ahead, approaching, potentially better or worse than where we are now, but fundamentally distinct from where we have been. The Aboriginal Australian traditions do not share this framework. Time, in those traditions, is not linear. The creation period, the dreaming or dream time as it is imperfectly translated, is not a time in the past. It is not a story about what happened before. It is a dimension of reality that underlies and interpenetrates the present. The beings and events of the dreaming are not historical in the Western sense. They are ongoing, they are accessible. They shape the landscape and the present-day relationships between people and country in ways that are immediate and real, not metaphorical. This is a radically different ontology, and it is not, despite its unfamiliarity to Western minds, irrational or prescientific. It is a framework for understanding the relationship between the past and the present that is, in certain respects, more accurate than the linear model. The past does not simply recede. It persists in the structure of the landscape, in the genetic inheritance of the living, in the cultural practices and knowledge systems that connect the present to the events that shaped it. The Aboriginal understanding that the past is not behind but beneath, that the present is always floating on top of a vast and still relevant history, is not a mystical claim. It is a precise phenomenological description of how history actually works. And for a people whose relationship with a specific landscape extends back further than any other human group's relationship with any specific landscape, that description carries a particular weight. The dreaming is not a metaphor for 65,000 years of continuous relationship with country. It is the experiential reality of that relationship, expressed in a framework that makes the depth of the relationship comprehensible and navigable. When an elder describes a specific site in the landscape as a dreaming place, as a location where a specific event in the creation period occurred, they are not making a claim about fiction or myth in the Western sense. They may be encoding geological knowledge about the actual formation of that site. They may be preserving navigational information about routes through the landscape. They may be maintaining ecological knowledge about the resources associated with that location. And they may also be making a claim about the ongoing relationship between human communities and the spiritual dimensions of the landscape that is not reducible to any of those more obviously practical functions. All of these layers coexist. That is the nature of the tradition. It does not separate the practical from the spiritual, the ecological from the cosmological, the historical from the present. They are all the same thing, expressed in a language that holds their unity, rather than fragmenting them into separate domains. What this means for our understanding of the megastructures is profound. The stone arrangements, the aquaculture systems, the astronomical alignments were not engineering projects separate from the spiritual life of the communities that built them. They were expressions of the same integrated understanding of the world that the dreaming framework describes. The aquaculture system was not just a food production technology. It was a participation in the life of the country, an expression of the relationship between the community and the waterways that flowed through their country, a physical manifestation of the obligations that the tradition placed on them as custodians of that country. The astronomical arrangements were not just calendars. They were participations in the movements of the sky beings that the tradition identifies, expressions of the community's relationship with those beings, physical embodiments of the knowledge that connected the ground to the sky. The stone arrangements on the plains and hillsides were not just ceremonial spaces, if ceremonial is understood to mean separate from the practical life of the community. They were places where the practical and the cosmological were integrated, where the management of the landscape and the management of the community's spiritual relationships were performed simultaneously. This integrated understanding does not make the structures less impressive as engineering. It makes them more impressive because it means they were designed to operate simultaneously on multiple levels that our fragmentary understanding can only appreciate separately. It also means that any investigation of these structures that approaches them solely as physical objects, that tries to understand them purely through material analysis without engaging with the knowledge traditions of the communities who built them, will necessarily produce an incomplete and probably misleading account. The physical structure is only one dimension of what these things were and are. the knowledge tradition is another. You cannot fully understand the first without the second. And the knowledge tradition is not static. It is not a fixed text that can be accessed and transcribed. It is a living system, carried by living people, embedded in living relationships with the landscape. To understand it requires not just documentation, but sustained, respectful, collaborative engagement with the communities who hold it. Engagement that operates on their terms, not on the terms of outside researchers with their own agendas and their own timelines. This is the model that is slowly beginning to be established in certain parts of Australian archaeology. It is the model that produces the kind of knowledge that is actually useful, that combines the material evidence with the knowledge tradition in ways that illuminate both. And it is the model that will eventually produce the full account of Australia's ancient history that the evidence demands and that the world deserves to know. Let us go further back, much further, because everything I have described so far, the aquaculture systems, the stone arrangements, the astronomical traditions, the maritime connections, sits within the period of human occupation as we currently understand it. The last 65,000 years, extraordinary as they are not the whole story, or rather, they may not be the whole story. And the possibility that they are not is the most provocative of all the ideas we will consider tonight. There is a category of evidence in Australia that does not fit within any conventional understanding of human prehistory, not within the conventional Australian timeline, not within the global timeline, not within any framework that the mainstream of archaeology or anthropology has been prepared to accommodate. This evidence consists of objects and marks found in geological contexts that should not contain evidence of human activity. In rock strata that were laid down millions of years ago, long before any species that we would call human existed, there have been described by various independent observers features that bear the appearance of being worked or manufactured. I am aware of how this sounds. I am aware that claims of this kind are regularly made by people with agendas far removed from sober historical inquiry, and that the vast majority of such claims, when examined carefully, turn out to reflect either natural processes that mimic artificial features or misidentification or misrepresentation of the stratigraphic context. But I am also aware of the principle that extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence, and that the appropriate response to extraordinary evidence is not denial but investigation. And some of the evidence in this category is sufficiently documented by sufficiently credible observers to deserve more investigation than it has received. I will not elaborate at length on this evidence tonight, because to do it justice would require a level of technical detail about geological stratigraphy and manufacturing analysis that goes beyond what a discussion of this kind can support. But I will note that it exists, that it has been documented, that it has been largely ignored by mainstream researchers who are not in a position to accommodate its implications within existing paradigms, and that the history of science is full of examples of evidence that was ignored for exactly these reasons, and that later required exactly the kind of paradigm revision that its initial reception had been designed to prevent. The deepest past of Australia may be deeper than we know. The human story in this landscape may be longer than our current tools and our current frameworks can measure. This is not a claim I am making. It is a possibility I am acknowledging. And acknowledging possibilities, even uncomfortable ones, especially uncomfortable ones, is what honest inquiry requires. Let me now draw some threads together. We began tonight with a simple observation: that Australia holds secrets, that the landscape of this continent, examined carefully and without prior assumption, reveals evidence of human activity that does not fit the conventional model of a simple, nomadic, pre-architectural past. We have examined specific categories of that evidence: aquaculture systems, stone arrangements, astronomical knowledge of extraordinary age and precision, coastal structures consistent with a maritime civilization, hydraulic engineering in the interior, underground spaces in regions of extreme aridity. We have considered the factors that have prevented this evidence from receiving the investigation it deserves: paradigm inertia, resource constraints, the political dimensions of ancient history in a settler colonial context, the complex and not always comfortable relationship between scientific investigation and indigenous cultural authority. And we have considered what the evidence honestly examined, suggests about the nature of the civilization that created it. A distributed network of communities connected by kinship, ceremony, and shared cosmological framework. A civilization that managed the landscape at continental scale for longer than any other human society we know of. A civilization that maintained knowledge traditions across timescales that put the entire written record of Western history in the shade. A civilization that was connected through maritime links and possibly through other connections we have not yet traced to the broader world beyond the shores of the continent. This is not a story about primitive people waiting to be civilized. It is a story about civilization. A different kind of civilization. One that operated by different principles and left different kinds of marks than the civilizations that the Western tradition has defined itself against. But civilization nonetheless. And it is a story that matters, not just because it is interesting, though it is extraordinarily interesting. Not just because it revises our understanding of the Australian past, though it revises it dramatically, but because it challenges the assumptions about human possibility that underlie our understanding of the present and the future. If human beings can maintain complex, sophisticated, ecologically sustainable civilization for 60,000 years without writing, without metallurgy, without the kinds of monuments that Western history uses to define achievement, then the category of civilization needs to be fundamentally rethought. If the knowledge encoded in the astronomical traditions of Aboriginal Australia is more precise and more ancient than anything the literate civilizations of Europe and Asia have produced, then literacy is not the ultimate technology of knowledge preservation that we have assumed it to be. If the ecological management practiced across the Australian continent for tens of thousands of years was more sophisticated and more sustainable than the agricultural and industrial systems that replaced it, then progress is not what we have been told it is. These are large revisions. They are not comfortable. They require not just an adjustment of our historical knowledge, but a rethinking of the values and assumptions that shape our current practice. The values of growth and accumulation and development that define modern civilization were not the values of the civilization that managed Australia for 60,000 years. And the civilization that managed Australia for 60,000 years survived, thrived, maintained itself, did not exhaust its resource base, did not destroy the conditions of its own existence. These are not small achievements. They are the most important achievements in human history, and they occurred in Australia. In the landscape that we have treated as a marginal footnote to the history of human civilization, when in fact it may be its most important chapter. Let me stay a moment longer with this thought, because I think it is worth staying with. 60,000 years, let me try to give that number some weight. The oldest written text in the world is about 5,000 years old. The Epic of Gilgamesh, the oldest surviving literary narrative, is about 4,000 years old. The pyramids at Giza are about 4,500 years old. The entire span of what Western history calls civilization, from the first cities of Mesopotamia to the present day, is approximately 10,000 years. A generous estimate. The Aboriginal peoples of Australia have maintained a continuous, functioning, sophisticated relationship with the Australian landscape for at least 6 times that span. 6 times the entire span of what we call civilization. And during that time, the relationship was not static. It was dynamic, responsive, intelligent. It adapted to the dramatic climate changes of the Ice Age and its aftermath. It absorbed and incorporated new knowledge. It maintained and transmitted the accumulated observations and insights of tens of thousands of generations. No other human society has done this. No other human relationship with a specific landscape has extended for this duration without catastrophic disruption. The Romans and the Greeks and the Egyptians and the Mesopotamians, for all their extraordinary achievements, are separated from their origins by cultural discontinuities, by conquest and displacement, by the kind of civilizational collapse that occasionally wipes the slate and requires reconstruction from fragments. The Aboriginal Australian tradition, damaged but not destroyed by colonialism, represents a continuity of human relationship with a specific place across a duration that has no parallel in the human record. If we could understand that tradition fully, with all its depth, and all its complexity, we would understand something about human possibility that no other evidence available to us could teach. We would understand how human beings and a specific landscape can coexist across geological time. We would understand what knowledge systems are capable of when they are organized for continuity rather than for rapid accumulation. We would understand what civilization looks like when it is designed to last rather than to grow. These are not abstract questions. They are among the most practically urgent questions that we face as a species at this moment in our history. And the answers to them are embedded in the landscape and the traditions of a continent that we have barely begun to take seriously. The investigation of Australia's ancient history is therefore not just a matter of correcting the historical record. It is a matter of urgency. Not the urgency of sensationalism, not the urgency of mystery solved or conspiracy revealed, the urgency of understanding. The urgency of a species that has arrived at a moment when the models that have guided it for the past few thousand years are visibly failing, and that needs to look in places it has not previously thought to look for the knowledge that might help it do better. Australia's ancient past is one of those places, and the megastructures and the knowledge systems and the civilizational achievements that it contains are not lost. They are present, damaged, obscured, incompletely understood, but present. They are waiting to be found, and finding them, truly finding them, with the attention and the respect and the resources that they deserve, may be one of the most important projects that human understanding currently faces. Tonight, lying wherever you are as these words find you, in whatever corner of the world, at whatever hour, you have traveled through some part of that deep Australian past. Through the red dust of the interior and the tidal channels of the coast and the vast star-filled silence of the night sky above the central desert, you have stood, at least in imagination, before stone arrangements that are older than the oldest text and channels cut by hands that have been dust for longer than our oldest civilizations have existed, and astronomical alignments that track a sky that has barely changed since those first eyes looked up at it in wonder. That is not nothing. That is, in fact, something extraordinary. The past is not behind us, it is beneath us. And in Australia, the depth of what is beneath is greater than anywhere else on Earth. Perhaps that is why the continent has always felt, to those who spend time in it, like somewhere ancient. Not just geologically ancient, though the rocks of the Pilbara and the Kimberley are among the oldest exposed rock on the surface of the Earth, but humanly ancient, like a place where the weight of time is different, where the ground carries more history than it is possible to comprehend. It does. That feeling is accurate, and the history it carries is only just beginning to be told. The wind moves across the red plain. The stars wheel overhead in the pattern that human eyes have watched from this exact continent for longer than those stars were named in any other language. Somewhere underground, water moves through passages in the rock, passages that may carry the marks of the hands that first opened them. In the stone on the hillside, lines drawn by artists whose names will never be known but whose precision and whose intention are still readable by those who approach with patience and care. Australia's lost megastructures from a civilization we can't explain, the title of tonight's journey. But perhaps, by now, the civilization feels a little less unexplainable, not fully explained, not mapped, not comprehensively understood, but no longer quite so lost. It was here. It is here. In the landscape, in the knowledge. In the living traditions of the descendants of those who built what we are only beginning to recognize as having been built. In the stone and the water and the sky that remember everything, even when we do not. Let the stars wheel. Let the red plain breathe in the dark. Let the water find its way underground through passages older than our oldest stories, and rest. The investigation will continue in the morning. For now, it is enough to know that the past is deep, and the depth is full of wonders, and the wonders are real. If this journey has found you somewhere close to sleep, then it has done what it was made for. Thank you for traveling with us through the deep Australian past. The next story is already waiting, in the dark and the silence, where all old stories live. But for tonight, drift now. Drift into the country that holds the oldest human history on Earth. It is vast enough to hold you too, and ancient enough to hold you gently. Rest well. There is one more direction that we have not yet traveled, one more thread that pulls at the edge of everything we have discussed tonight. And it concerns not what was built in Australia, or even who built it, but the question of what knowledge was carried away from Australia, or arrived from elsewhere, or passed through this landscape on its way to becoming something else entirely. The question of transmission. Every human civilization that we study in detail turns out, on examination, to be a receiver as much as a generator. The Greeks, whom Western history loves to credit with the invention of philosophy and democracy and systematic inquiry, were drawing heavily on knowledge traditions from Egypt and Mesopotamia and Persia and beyond. The Renaissance, which Western history loves to identify as a rebirth of classical knowledge, was itself fed by the preservation of that classical knowledge in Arabic manuscripts, maintained by Islamic scholars through the centuries that the European tradition calls the Dark Ages. The agricultural revolution, which is usually described as if it happened in one place and spread outward, actually occurred independently in multiple locations around the world, suggesting either that the conditions for it arose simultaneously across different ecological zones, or that its preconditions were transmitted in ways we do not yet understand. Knowledge moves. It has always moved. And in the deep past, before writing fixed it in texts that could travel only as fast as the texts themselves, it moved in people. In the stories that people carried in their memories, the skills that people carried in their hands, the observations that people carried in their understanding of the world around them, it moved with migration. It moved with trade. It moved with the maritime connections that linked the Australian coastline to the Indonesian archipelago and beyond. And it moved, perhaps, in ways that left traces not in physical structures or in genetic signatures, but in the shared elements of knowledge traditions that appear across cultures in ways that have never been satisfactorily explained by independent invention. Consider the astronomical traditions. The Aboriginal Australian knowledge of the sky, as we have discussed, is extraordinarily precise and extraordinarily old, but it is not unique in its precision. The astronomical traditions of ancient India, of Mesopotamia, of Egypt, of the Maya and the Aztec and the Inca, all share a level of systematic sky observation that goes far beyond what casual naked eye observation would produce. They all encode precise knowledge of the movements of the sun, the moon, the visible planets, and specific stars. They all use this knowledge for purposes that combine the practical and the ceremonial. And they all, in their earliest forms, appear to be drawing on knowledge that was already ancient when the traditions themselves are first documented in the historical record. Where did that knowledge come from? The standard answer is that it developed independently, in multiple locations, as human intelligence applied itself to the same sky. And that answer is not wrong. Human beings everywhere have always watched the sky and noticed patterns. The capacity for systematic astronomical observation is part of the general cognitive toolkit of our species. But the specific content of astronomical knowledge traditions, the particular numbers, the particular cycles, the particular ways of organizing observation and calculating periodicities, varies across cultures in ways that sometimes suggest independent development and sometimes suggest something else, something shared, something transmitted. The specific case of certain astronomical cycle lengths appearing in traditions separated by enormous geographical distance has been studied by researchers in the history of science for more than a century without achieving consensus. Some researchers believe the appearances are coincidental, or the result of the independent discovery of astronomical cycles that are genuinely universal. Others believe they reflect transmission, the movement of knowledge along trade routes and through maritime connections that we have underestimated. If Australia was a node in a network of maritime connection that extended across the Indian Ocean and potentially across the Pacific, as the evidence suggests it may have been, then the astronomical knowledge tradition of Aboriginal Australia was not isolated from the global development of astronomical science. It was part of it, contributing to it and receiving from it across the timescales involved. This is speculative. The connections are not proven, but the possibility is real, and the implications of taking it seriously are significant. If the oldest astronomical tradition in the world, which exists in Australia, was connected to the development of astronomical knowledge traditions elsewhere, then the history of science itself has an Australian chapter that has never been written. We have spoken at length about the physical evidence, the structures and the systems and the signs in the landscape. Let us now speak about something that the physical evidence points toward but cannot fully contain. The question of what it was like to live within this civilization. What it felt like to be a person in this world, in this landscape, in this extraordinary depth of human time. Imagine waking up in a settlement on the edge of what is now the Lake Eyre Basin, but in a time when the basin held water, when the channels that fed it ran strongly through the seasons, when the grasslands beyond the water's edge carried the animals that made this place rich. The air is cool before the sun rises. You have slept in a sheltered space, perhaps beneath a stone overhang, perhaps in a structure whose walls are the work of many hands across many generations. The fire has burned to coals through the night, and someone is already awake, feeding it back to life with the practiced movements of a person who has performed this action every morning of their life. Around you, the sounds of a community rousing, children who wake with the quick energy of children everywhere, the movement of people toward water, the quiet conversations of people who have known each other entirely, whose lives are woven together in the specific way that lives are woven together in small communities that share everything, including the knowledge of each other's histories and the obligations of each other's relationships. You know this landscape as well as you know your own hands. You were taught it from the time you could walk, by people who were taught it by the people before them, in a chain of teaching and learning that extends back into the dreaming, back to the time when the landscape itself was being shaped by the beings whose actions made it what it is. The waterhole to the east is known to you not just as a feature of the geography, but as a place in the story, a place where something happened, something that matters, something that places this waterhole in relationship to other places in a network of meaning that covers the entire country. You know what the sky tells you. You know which stars are rising now and what their rising means for the season. You know that the particular cluster of stars that your tradition associates with a specific set of relationships is positioned tonight exactly where it will be in one more cycle of the moon, which means the time is approaching for the gathering that will bring your community into contact with the communities from the north and the east. That gathering will last several weeks. There will be ceremony. There will be the exchange of objects that have traveled from far away, shells from the northern coast, stone from quarries, a month's walk to the west. There will be the resolution of disputes that have built up during the long period of separation. There will be marriages arranged, alliances renewed, knowledge exchanged, and there will be the maintenance of the astronomical record, the careful noting, by the designated knowledge holders from each community, of any variations in the positions of specific stars from the predicted positions, the comparison of those notes across communities to check for consistency and to correct for any errors that have crept into any individual tradition. The system is not written, but it is not therefore imprecise. It is maintained through a practice of cross-checking and verification that achieves a level of accuracy that writing might actually make harder, because writing freezes knowledge in a specific moment rather than allowing it to be continually checked against current observation. This is what civilization looks like when it is organized not for growth but for continuity, not for accumulation but for accuracy, not for the production of surplus wealth but for the reproduction of the conditions that make good lives possible across generations. It looks different from what we are used to imagining as civilization. It is harder to see in the archaeological record because it builds with knowledge rather than with stone. But the stone it does build with is there, and the knowledge it maintains is there. And the lives it makes possible, lived in the intimate knowledge of a specific landscape across the vast stretch of time that the Australian record represents, were not lesser lives for the absence of writing or metal or cities. They were, in many ways, fuller lives, lives with a depth of belonging and a depth of knowledge that the subsequent history of civilization has not managed to replace. Let us follow the channels of the ancient water systems a little further, because they take us somewhere that the broad sweep of historical narrative sometimes fails to reach. They take us to the specific, the human scale, the domestic. In the system of channels and weirs and pools that constituted the aquaculture infrastructure of the continent's interior waterways, there were people whose specific job was the management of those systems. Not every person in every community was equally responsible for the maintenance of the infrastructure. There were those who held specialized knowledge of the hydraulics, who understood how the flow needed to be modified in dry seasons, and how excess water needed to be redirected in flood. There were those who monitored the health of the fish populations and who made the decisions about when and how many could be harvested without reducing the population below the level needed for sustained yield. There were those who maintained the physical structure, who knew which sections needed reinforcement, which weirs needed clearing of accumulated debris, which channels had silted and needed to be opened again. This is specialization. Not the elaborate specialization of an urban economy, where hundreds of distinct occupations exist simultaneously in a dense population center. But genuine specialization, the allocation of different members of the community to different functions based on knowledge and aptitude and training. And specialization requires a social structure that can sustain it, that can ensure that the specialist in hydraulics is fed even when she is working on the channels rather than gathering food. That can ensure that the knowledge of the specialist is transmitted to the next generation before it is lost. The social structures that sustained this specialization in Aboriginal Australian communities are documented, though imperfectly, in the ethnographic record of the contact period. They are complex. They involve the management of both practical and ceremonial obligations. A division of responsibility that is not, in the Aboriginal framework, actually a division, since the practical and the ceremonial are always aspects of the same thing. But they are clear enough that we can see in them the outline of a system capable of sustaining the kind of specialized labor that the aquaculture infrastructure required. And the infrastructure is not small. The Buj Bim system, the one we can document most clearly, covers more than 100 square kilometers. The channels run for kilometers. The weirs number in the dozens. The pools and traps are complex enough in their hydraulic design that the engineers who have studied them express genuine admiration for whoever figured out how they needed to work. This is not a casual project. It is a major engineering achievement, and it was maintained across thousands of years. To maintain infrastructure across thousands of years, you need more than engineering knowledge. You need institutional memory. You need the mechanism by which the knowledge of why this particular weir is shaped the way it is, and what will happen if you rebuild it differently, is transmitted from the person who knows it to the person who needs to know it. You need training. You need apprenticeship. You need the kind of deliberate knowledge transmission that is itself a technology, as sophisticated in its own domain as the physical engineering it serves. The evidence that this kind of institutional knowledge transmission existed is all around us in the surviving traditions. The specific knowledge of specific sites, maintained in the songs and stories associated with those sites. The specific knowledge of specific ecological relationships, maintained in the ceremony that enacts those relationships. The specific knowledge of specific engineering, maintained in the teaching that accompanies the practical work of maintaining the systems. This is a civilization of knowledge, a civilization that invested its most significant energies not in building monuments to its own importance, but in maintaining and transmitting the knowledge needed for its own continuation. A civilization that understood, at some deep level, that the most valuable thing it could produce was not a surplus of material goods, but a surplus of understanding, a surplus of the specific, hard-won, experientially grounded knowledge of how to live well in a specific place, across a specific climate, in relationship with specific other beings. That understanding is exactly what the subsequent civilization, the civilization that arrived from Europe in the late 18th century and displaced the existing one, lacked. The Europeans who arrived in Australia were, by the standards of their own tradition, extraordinarily capable people. They brought sophisticated technology, a rich intellectual tradition, complex social institutions, impressive medical knowledge, and the accumulated achievements of the post-agricultural civilizational project of the past 10,000 years. But they did not know how to live in Australia. and what they did not know killed them and damaged the landscape in ways from which it has still not recovered. They introduced species that the ecosystem had no defenses against. They suppressed the fire management that had maintained the vegetation mosaic for tens of thousands of years, resulting in the accumulation of fuel loads that eventually produced the catastrophic fires that the continent now experiences with increasing frequency. They extracted the resources of the land with the logic of a civilization that had always moved on when resources were exhausted, in a landscape that did not have the resource density to survive that approach. They built infrastructure based on the water assumptions of a European climate, in a landscape whose water behavior was radically different from anything in the European experience. The knowledge they needed was present. It was present in the communities they displaced, in the traditions they disrupted, in the landscape practices they suppressed. It was offered, in some cases, by Aboriginal people who understood what the Europeans were doing wrong and who tried, in the ways available to them, to share what they knew. It was rejected, because the civilization that arrived from Europe did not have the framework to recognize that what it was encountering was a knowledge tradition more sophisticated in its specific domain than anything it had brought with it. The cost of that failure of recognition is still being paid. In the declining health of Australian ecosystems, in the increasing frequency and severity of drought and flood, in the loss of biodiversity, in the cultural damage done to communities whose knowledge systems were disrupted before they could be fully recorded. But the knowledge is not all gone. Some of it has survived in living traditions. Some of it can be recovered from the landscape itself, from the physical evidence of how the land was managed. Some of it is preserved in the oral traditions that have maintained their continuity despite everything that has been thrown against them. And some of it is being actively reconstructed by Aboriginal communities who are bringing the fragments together and testing them against the landscape and finding, consistently, that they work. The restoration of fire management practices to Australian landscapes is the most visible example of this. In areas where traditional burning has been restored, the ecological results have been dramatic. The mosaic of vegetation types that traditional burning creates supports greater biodiversity than the uniform vegetation that develops in the absence of burning. The frequency and severity of uncontrolled wildfire is reduced because the fuel loads that feed catastrophic fires are regularly cleared by the controlled burns. The cultural relationships between communities and country are strengthened because the burning is not just an ecological practice but a ceremonial one, a re-engagement with the obligations and relationships that connect community to landscape. This is not nostalgia. It is not romanticism. It is empirical ecology. The practices that maintain the Australian landscape for 60,000 years are being demonstrated in real time to be more effective than the practices that replace them. And that demonstration is, in its own way, the most powerful argument for taking the deep past of this continent seriously. Not as history, though it is important as history, but as knowledge, as the most thoroughly tested knowledge system in human existence. Now let us take a different path through the material. Let us talk about the sky not as an object of knowledge but as an actor in the story. Because in the Australian ancient tradition, the relationship between sky and land is not the relationship between observer and observed. It is a relationship between participants, between beings engaged in an ongoing relationship that has consequences for both. The stars, in Aboriginal Australian tradition, are not simply points of light whose positions mark the calendar. They are beings. They have identities, relationships, histories, intentions. The Milky Way is not a band of distant suns. It is a path, a river, a journey undertaken by specific beings in the dreaming that continues to be traveled. The dark patches in the Milky Way, the gaps between the bright regions of star density, are not absences. In the tradition of several Aboriginal groups, they are animals. The emu in the sky, one of the most famous examples, is not drawn from the bright stars but from the dark spaces between them, the dark nebulae that create the silhouette of an emu in the band of the Milky Way. And the emu in the sky is not just a beautiful image. It is a calendar. The specific orientation of the emu in the sky, the angle at which it appears above the horizon, tells observers exactly when the emus on the ground will be nesting, when the eggs will be laid, When the time has come to seek emu eggs, which are a significant food resource, the sky emu and the land emu are in relationship, the movements of the sky being reflect and predict the behavior of the land being. The astronomy and the ecology are one knowledge system. This is the kind of integrated, functional, precise knowledge that we are talking about when we describe the Aboriginal astronomical tradition as sophisticated. Not sophisticated in the sense of being complicated for its own sake. Sophisticated in the sense of being precisely calibrated to serve real purposes in ways that have been tested across tens of thousands of years of continuous use. No other astronomical tradition in the world can make that claim. The Babylonian tradition, impressive as it is, extends back perhaps 3,000 years in its written form, perhaps a few thousand more if we include the knowledge that underlies the earliest written astronomical texts. The Chinese tradition is similar in depth. The Indian tradition may be somewhat deeper, but none of them approaches 60,000 years of continuous engagement with the same sky from the same latitude, tested continuously against the outcomes they were designed to predict. The Aboriginal Australian astronomical tradition is therefore not just the oldest in the world. It is the most thoroughly, empirically tested astronomical tradition in the world. Its survival and its continued accuracy in the domains where it has been checked against modern astronomical data is the most direct evidence available that systematic, precise astronomical knowledge can be maintained across the kinds of timescales involved without writing, without instruments, without institutional frameworks of the kind that Western science considers necessary for the maintenance of precise knowledge. This has implications for our understanding of knowledge transmission that go far beyond Australian archaeology. It suggests that the oral tradition, properly structured and properly maintained, is capable of preserving information with a precision and across a duration that exceeds what the literate tradition has previously been willing to credit. And it suggests that the transition from oral to literate knowledge transmission, which Western history treats as an unambiguous advance, may have involved losses as well as gains. The gains are real and significant, but so may be the losses. A knowledge tradition that is maintained orally, in community, embedded in ceremony and practice, and the ongoing relationship of community with landscape is checked continuously against experience. Every season, the astronomical predictions are tested. Every harvest, the ecological knowledge is verified. Every flood, the hydraulic predictions are confirmed or disconfirmed. Error is visible in a way that error in a written text is not. Error in a written text can persist, unexamined, for generations, if the text is treated as authoritative, and if the practices that would detect the error are no longer maintained. The oral tradition, by contrast, has built-in quality control, not perfect quality control. Errors do accumulate in oral traditions. Specific elements are lost or transformed as the traditions age. But the errors that accumulate in oral traditions that are maintained by communities in ongoing relationship with the phenomena the traditions describe are self-correcting in ways that written traditions that have lost contact with practice are not. This is a genuinely important insight for our understanding of knowledge systems, and it comes from taking seriously the achievements of the Aboriginal Australian astronomical tradition and asking what those achievements tell us about how knowledge can work. Let us widen our gaze one more time to take in the full picture of what we have been exploring tonight. We have been traveling through the ancient Australian past, through sites and systems and traditions that challenge the conventional account of what this continent was and what its people achieved. We have found evidence of landscape-scale engineering, of astronomical sophistication, of maritime connection, of social organization more complex than the standard model allows. But let me place all of this in a larger frame. The story of human civilization, as it is usually told, is a story of progress from simple to complex, from primitive to sophisticated, from natural to cultural. It places the origin of meaningful human achievement at the moment of the agricultural revolution 10,000 years ago, and sees everything before that as prologue, as backdrop, as the barely differentiated state from which civilization eventually emerged. This story is not just incomplete, it is wrong. Not wrong in its facts, for the most part, but wrong in its framing. Wrong in what it chooses to value. wrong in what it is willing to count as achievement. Wrong in the assumption that the specific path that Western civilization followed across the past 10,000 years is the natural or inevitable or superior path that the human experiment must take. Australia's deep past offers an alternative account, an account in which the most impressive human achievement is not the pyramid or the printing press or the quantum computer, but the maintenance of a functional, adaptive, knowledge-based civilization across 65,000 years of continuous engagement with one of the most challenging environments on Earth. An account in which intelligence is demonstrated not by the accumulation of material complexity, but by the development of the specific, precise, tested knowledge needed to live well in a specific place without exhausting it. That alternative account does not deny the achievements of the civilization that built the pyramids and the printing press. Those achievements are real and they are extraordinary, but it places them in context. It asks whether they are sustainable. It asks what has been lost in the process of achieving them. And it asks whether there are lessons available in the Australian record and in the traditions that derive from it that the current phase of the global civilizational project urgently needs to learn. These are not academic questions. They are practical ones. The landscapes that are degrading under the pressure of industrial civilization include the Australian landscape, which is degrading less quickly in the places where traditional management practices have been maintained than in the places where they have been replaced. The knowledge systems that are being lost to the pressure of cultural homogenization include the Aboriginal Australian knowledge systems, which contain information about ecology and hydrology and land management that no other source can supply. The civilizational model that is proving inadequate to the challenges of the present century is the model that has consistently dismissed the Australian example as primitive and irrelevant. Taking Australia's ancient past seriously is therefore not just a matter of correcting the historical record, it is a matter of practical urgency. The knowledge that this continent and its people hold is needed. The investigation that will recover and document and make accessible the full scope of Australia's ancient history is not just intellectually valuable. It is one of the contributions that historical inquiry can make to the practical challenges of the present. But tonight, lying wherever you are, at whatever hour this finds you, we do not need to carry that urgency. Tonight, it is enough to know that the story is there, that the megastructures are real, that the civilization is not lost, only waiting to be seen, that the landscape of Australia, in its ancient silence and its red distances and its star-filled sky, carries a human history more deep and more complex and more extraordinary than anything we have yet been prepared to acknowledge. Let the channels carry the water they have carried for longer than memory. Let the stone arrangements hold the alignments they were built to hold, patient in the desert, waiting for the light to return to exactly the angle that illuminates their purpose. Let the knowledge held in living tradition continue to speak to those with the patience and the respect to listen about the world as it was and as it still is beneath the surface that we see. And let us rest in the knowledge that we are, all of us, products of a human past far deeper than we usually allow ourselves to remember. Products of 60,000 years of continuous human engagement with this planet. Products of the accumulated wisdom and the accumulated mistakes of our ancestors in every landscape where they lived and learned and adapted and survived. That past is not lost, it is present. In the stone, in the sky, in the water, in the living knowledge of the communities that have maintained their connection to it across every disruption that history has imposed on them. Let the stars wheel, let the red plain breathe in the dark. Let the water find its way underground through passages older than our oldest stories. And rest. The investigation will continue in the morning. For now, it is enough to know that the past is deep, and the depth is full of wonders, and the wonders are real. If this journey has found you somewhere close to sleep, then it has done what it was made for. Thank you for traveling with us through the deep Australian past. The next story is already waiting, in the dark and the silence, where all old stories live. But for tonight, drift now. Drift into the country that holds the oldest human history on Earth. It is vast enough to hold you to, and ancient enough to hold you gently. Rest well. Let me take you back now to a place we have not yet visited tonight. Back to the northern coast, where the tropical sea meets the ancient stone, and where the evidence of contact and civilization presses against us from every direction. The Kimberley region of northwestern Australia is one of the most geologically ancient landscapes on Earth. The rocks here were formed more than 3 billion years ago, before the first complex life evolved in the oceans below a sky that contained no oxygen. They have been shaped by every climate the planet has cycled through since then. By ice ages and by periods of warmth so intense that sea levels were 20 meters higher than today, by the slow cracking of continents and the equally slow collision of tectonic plates, by billions of years of rain and wind and the patient work of water finding its way through stone, and they have been shaped, for the last 65,000 years or more, by human beings. The Kimberley is famous, in the narrow world of Australian archaeology, for its rock art. The art tradition here is called the Gwion style, named in the language of the Ngarrindjin people, though it was known to non-Aboriginal Australia by the name Bradshaw art, after the pastoralist Joseph Bradshaw, who described it to the outside world in 1891. The figures are extraordinary. They are stylized, highly detailed human figures with elaborate headdresses, tassels, sashes, and what appear to be ceremonial objects. The painting technique shows a level of sophistication and detail that surprised every outside observer who encountered it. These are not the simple outline figures of much Australian rock art. They are complex, dynamic, detailed representations of human beings engaged in activities that suggest a sophisticated ceremonial life. They are also very old. Precise dating of the Gwion figures has proven methodologically difficult, but various lines of evidence suggest that at least some of them predate the last major wet period in the Kimberley, which ended approximately 5,000 years ago. Some researchers believe they are considerably older, perhaps 17,000 years old or more. The figures are overprinted in some locations by art from later traditions, demonstrating that they were made earlier. But how much earlier remains a subject of careful investigation. What makes the Gwion figures particularly striking in the context of what we have been discussing tonight is what they may tell us about the people who made them. The elaborate costumes depicted in the figures suggest a society with complex ceremonial traditions that included sophisticated body adornment, significant organizational structure for ceremonies requiring this level of preparation, and the technical capacity to produce the materials depicted. The figures also suggest long-distance trade, because some of the materials implied by the depicted ornaments, feathers of specific bird species, shells of specific marine origin, do not occur naturally in the region where the figures are found. This is important. Long-distance trade requires reliable networks of exchange. It requires trust between communities separated by significant distance. It requires an economic surplus sufficient to make exchange worthwhile. And it requires communication, the kind of regular contact through which trading relationships are established and maintained. All of these things are present in the ethnographic record of Aboriginal communities in the historical period. They were present, the Gwion figures suggest, at least several thousand years before that, and probably much longer. The Gwion tradition, whatever its ultimate age, is a window into a world of cultural complexity that the standard model of Australian prehistory has been slow to accommodate. It shows us a society engaged in ceremonial practices of a sophistication that requires extended community effort, specialized skills, and access to materials from distant regions. It shows us, in other words, a society with the organizational complexity to produce those things. Let us now move away from the visual evidence for a moment and consider the evidence of the land itself, the way the landscape has been shaped not just by the management practices I have already described, but by the cumulative choices of millions of people over tens of thousands of years. There is a concept in ecology called the shifting baseline problem. It describes the tendency of each generation to treat the conditions it first encounters as the natural baseline, and to measure subsequent change against that baseline rather than against the conditions that existed before human influence began. The result is that the baseline itself keeps shifting, each generation thinking that the slightly degraded version they differed is the natural state, and each generation measuring decline only from that point forward. In Australia, the shifting baseline problem is particularly acute because the period of colonial disruption happened so recently and so dramatically that the baseline has shifted, in some landscapes, by an extraordinary amount in less than 2 centuries. The forests are less dense, the grasslands are less diverse, the water systems are less reliable, the animal populations are smaller and less varied. All of this has happened within the documented historical period, which means it is measurable, but it is often described as if it were natural variation rather than the consequences of the removal of the management system that had maintained the previous conditions for tens of thousands of years. Recognizing the shifting baseline means recognizing that the Australia of 200 years ago was not a natural system, it was a managed system. It was the product of 65,000 years of deliberate human stewardship, and it was, by most ecological measures, a more productive, more biodiverse, more resilient system than what has replaced it. This recognition has begun to inform Australian conservation practice, slowly and imperfectly. The recognition that traditional burning restores biodiversity and reduces fire risk has led to the reintroduction of burning in some landscapes. The recognition that traditional management of waterways improved fish populations has begun to influence thinking about freshwater management. The recognition that traditional land management in arid regions maintained productive conditions that modern pastoral use has degraded is beginning to influence the design of conservation areas. But these changes are taking place against a background of ongoing loss. The Aboriginal communities whose knowledge these changes depend on are themselves still dealing with the consequences of colonial disruption. They are communities where the intergenerational transmission of knowledge was forcibly interrupted in living memory, where specific knowledge that took tens of thousands of years to develop was lost in a generation when the people who held it were removed from the country where it had been developed and applied. The restoration of practice depends on the survival of knowledge. And the survival of knowledge depends on the survival of the communities and relationships in which knowledge lives. This is why the investigation of Australia's ancient past is inseparable from the support of Aboriginal communities in the present, not because the two things are metaphorically connected, because they are literally connected. The past survives in the present. The knowledge that makes sense of the archaeology lives in living people. To study the one without supporting the other is to study a text while destroying the library. Now, I want to take you somewhere that might seem like a departure from the main thread of what we have been discussing tonight, but it is actually the heart of it. Let us talk about what it means to know something, not to have information about something, not to be able to state facts about something, but to know something in the deep sense. The way a person knows a landscape they have lived in for their entire life, and whose parents lived in it, and whose parents' parents lived in it, back through an unbroken chain of residence and observation, and accumulated experience that is longer than any library. Western epistemology, the Western theory of knowledge, has for most of its history privileged a particular kind of knowing, propositional knowledge. Knowledge that can be stated, that can be written down, that can be communicated in language from person to person without requiring the recipient to have any direct experience of what is being communicated. This kind of knowledge is extraordinarily powerful. It is the foundation of science and technology. It allows knowledge to accumulate across generations in ways that do not depend on the survival of any particular individual or community. It has been responsible for most of the material achievements of the past 10,000 years, but it is not the only kind of knowing. And it is not, in many important respects, the deepest kind of knowing. There is another kind of knowing that philosophers have called tacit knowledge, or skill knowledge, or embodied knowledge. This is the knowledge that is in the hands as much as in the mind. The knowledge that a master craftsperson has of their material. The knowledge that a skilled hunter has of the behavior of the animal they are pursuing. The knowledge that an experienced navigator has of the sea. This kind of knowledge cannot be fully communicated in propositions. It can be partially described, but the description does not contain the knowledge. The knowledge lives in the practice. It is acquired by doing, under the guidance of someone who already has it, and it is maintained by continued practice. And there is a third kind of knowing, which Western epistemology has been even slower to recognize, because it falls outside the categories that Western intellectual tradition has been comfortable with. This is the knowledge that exists in the relationship between a community and a specific place, accumulated across generations of intimate engagement with that place, encoded in story and ceremony and practice, not separable from the specific relationships and the specific landscape that it describes. This third kind of knowing is what the Aboriginal Australian tradition calls, among other things, the dreaming. Not the only name for it, not the full description of it, but a pointer toward a kind of knowledge that is not individual, not propositional, and not separable from the specific place and the specific community in which it lives. A kind of knowledge that is, in the most literal sense, alive, that grows and changes as the community and the landscape change, that responds to new conditions while maintaining its deep continuity with what it has always been. This kind of knowledge is what the megastructures were built from. Not the engineering knowledge of how to cut stone or manage water flow, though that was part of it. The deeper knowledge of why, to build here and not there, of what this structure was for in the web of relationships between this community and this landscape and this sky and this set of obligations to past and future generations. The knowledge of the meaning of the building, which is what made it worth building. We cannot recover that meaning from the structures alone. We can read the hydraulics, we can measure the astronomical alignments, we can map the distribution of construction material and the relationship between sites. All of that tells us something. But the meaning, the reason, the context of obligation and relationship and cosmological understanding within which the building made sense, that lives only in the tradition. And the tradition is not dead. It is diminished. It is fragmented. But it lives in the communities who have maintained their connection to this country across everything that has been thrown against them. This is what makes the collaboration between archaeology and living Aboriginal communities not just ethically important, but epistemically essential. Without the tradition, the structures are mute. With the tradition, they begin to speak. And what they say, when we can hear it, is something that the rest of the world urgently needs to understand. Let us walk together now through a different part of the landscape. Let us go to the southeast, to the country of the Murray-Darling Basin, which drains the most productive agricultural land in modern Australia, and which was, before the colonial transformation, one of the most densely populated regions of the continent. The Murray River and its tributaries flow through a landscape of extraordinary ecological richness. The wetlands and billabongs along the river margins supported enormous populations of waterbirds, fish, mammals, and the plant communities that fed them. The grassy woodlands of the uplands carried populations of kangaroo and wallaby and the smaller animals of the understory. The river itself was a highway, connecting the populations of the highlands to those of the lowland floodplains. In this landscape, the populations of Aboriginal people were not small. Archaeological evidence, combined with the accounts of early European observers who arrived before the full impact of the introduced diseases had reduced the population, suggests that the Murray-Darling Basin supported populations numbering in the tens of thousands, possibly more. These were not populations distributed in small isolated bands. They were populations connected by the river system, organized into complex regional networks, capable of gathering in large numbers for ceremony and exchange, and sustained by the rich resources that the carefully managed landscape provided. The management of that landscape was not casual. The waterways were managed for fish production, using techniques similar to those of the Budge BIM system, but adapted to the different hydraulic conditions of the major river network. The grasslands were managed with fire to promote the growth of seed-producing plants and to maintain the open conditions that the large grazing animals required. The wetlands were managed to regulate the patterns of flooding that supported the waterbird nesting seasons and that controlled the distribution of water plants that were themselves food resources. The cumulative effect of this management was a landscape that looked, to the first European observers, like a natural paradise. River red gum forests so ancient and so vast that they dwarfed the forests of Europe. Wetlands teeming with birds in numbers that seemed impossible, grasslands rolling to the horizon without interruption, fish in the river so abundant that nets could be pulled full without effort. None of this was natural. All of it was managed. The ancient river red gums stood where they stood, because fire management had been used for thousands of years to prevent the encroachment of understory vegetation that would otherwise have competed with their regeneration. The wetland bird populations were that large because the nesting conditions were maintained by the deliberate management of flood timing and extent. The grassland seed production was that rich because the burning regime promoted exactly the species that produced the most abundant and nutritious seeds. And this management was not maintaining a static condition. It was continuously adapted to the changing conditions of the river system, to the wet years and the dry years, to the flood seasons and the droughts, to the long-term shifts in climate that have characterized the Australian interior for the full duration of human occupation. The people who managed the Murray-Darling landscape were not simply conserving what was there. They were actively shaping what it became, generation by generation, responding to change with the intimate knowledge of people who had been paying close attention to this specific system for longer than we can precisely measure. What they created, over those tens of thousands of years of active management, was a food production system of extraordinary reliability and extraordinary productivity. A system that could sustain large human populations without depleting the resource base, because it was designed not just for the current season but for the next generation and the generation after that. This is food system design. This is landscape architecture. This is, in the fullest sense of the term, civilization. And it was destroyed, not slowly, quickly. Within decades of the arrival of European settlement, the managed landscape of the Murray-Darling Basin was transformed beyond recognition. The burning regime that maintained the grasslands was suppressed. The fish traps and weirs that managed the river's productivity were removed or blocked. The wetlands were drained for agriculture. The introduced animals, sheep and cattle and rabbits and foxes and cats, remade the ecological relationships that the management system had maintained. The people who held the knowledge of how to maintain the system were removed from the land, either by death, from introduced disease, by forced relocation, or by the violence of dispossession. The result, which we live with today, is a river system in crisis. The Murray-Darling is one of the most heavily managed river systems in the world, in the modern engineering sense, with dams and weirs and extraction licenses and flow management agreements that represent the enormous technical effort of modern water engineering. And despite all of that modern engineering, the system is degraded. The wetlands are diminished. The fish populations are a fraction of what they were. The water quality has declined. The ancient river red gum forests are stressed by altered flood regimes. The system is in crisis despite modern engineering, not because modern engineering is inadequate, but because modern engineering is trying to manage a system that it does not fully understand, using models that do not capture the full complexity of the relationships that make the system function. The models that did capture that complexity, the models that had been tested against the system for tens of thousands of years and refined accordingly, were in the heads of the people who were removed from the land. The loss of those models is one of the great intellectual catastrophes of the colonial period, not just a cultural tragedy, though it is certainly that. An ecological and practical catastrophe, the consequences of which are still playing out in the degradation of one of Australia's most important ecosystems. Recovering those models, even fragmentarily, even partially, is one of the most important projects that Australian ecology and water management currently faces. And the recovery depends on the same thing that the recovery of the understanding of the megastructures depends on: the engagement with the living descendants of the people who held the knowledge, on their terms, in relationship rather than in extraction. Let me now come to what is perhaps the most mysterious and least discussed category of evidence in the entire portfolio of Australian ancient history. And it is mysterious not because the evidence is ambiguous, but because its existence is so poorly known outside the small world of researchers who have engaged with it. It concerns the possibility that certain elements of the Australian archaeological record, specific objects and specific features in specific sites, are not explicable by reference to any technology that was present in the region at the dates suggested by the stratigraphy and the geological context. Let me be careful here. I am not making sensational claims. I am describing a pattern of anomalous evidence that has been documented by people with relevant credentials, that has been set aside rather than disproven, and that deserves more serious investigation than it has received. The objects in question include items found in geological contexts that indicate extreme antiquity, contexts that predate the conventional timeline for the development of the technologies implied by the objects. In some cases, these are items that show signs of precise working that the tools available at the relevant date should not have been capable of producing. In others, they are items of a material composition that does not occur naturally in the region, and that implies either long-distance transport or a manufacturing process that we have not attributed to the relevant period. None of these items has been the subject of a rigorous, published, peer-reviewed analysis that established both their authenticity and their precise geological context beyond reasonable scientific doubt. That is the honest statement of where the evidence stands. But the absence of rigorous peer-reviewed analysis is not the same as the absence of evidence. In most cases, the analysis has not been done because the resources have not been provided and because the institutional framework for taking the evidence seriously enough to fund the analysis does not exist. What would it take to analyze these anomalies properly? It would take a funded research program with the mandate to document them systematically, to collect samples for dating and material analysis, to establish their geological context with precision, and to subject the results to the full scrutiny of peer review. It would take researchers willing to risk professional standing on the investigation of claims that the mainstream has categorized as fringe. And it would take a broader public and institutional willingness to accept that the outcomes of such investigation might require significant revision of the accepted timeline. None of these things is currently present in sufficient quantity, but the evidence is there, and it will not go away simply because it has not been adequately investigated. I return, as I have returned throughout tonight's journey, to the fundamental point. The landscape of Australia holds more than we have yet been willing to acknowledge. The human history of this continent is deeper, more complex, more architecturally and technologically sophisticated, and more connected to the broader human story than the conventional model has allowed. The investigation of that history is one of the most important intellectual projects currently available to us. And the obstacles to that investigation are not primarily technical. They are primarily matters of priority, of funding, of institutional willingness, and of the courage to follow evidence where it leads, even when it leads somewhere uncomfortable. As the night deepens wherever you are, and as the words of this journey grow softer and the distances between thoughts begin to lengthen into the long rhythms of approaching sleep, I want to leave you with one last image. Somewhere in Central Australia, in the country of the deep desert where the stars are more present than the earth on clear nights, there is a particular stone that has been sitting in a particular position for a very long time. It is not a remarkable stone by ordinary observation. It is a piece of sandstone, roughly flat on one side, worn smooth on the edges by the actions of wind and water across years that accumulate into something beyond ordinary counting. It sits in a slight depression in the ground, which keeps it from being blown away by the winds that move across the open plain. On its smooth face, very faintly visible in the light of early morning when the sun strikes at exactly the right angle, are marks. Not the random scoring of geological accident, not the pitting of weathering. Marks, made deliberately, by a hand that held an implement and pressed it against the stone with intention, in a specific direction, at a specific angle, producing a specific result. The marks are abstract. They do not obviously depict anything. They are a series of curved lines that intersect in a pattern that has no obvious meaning to a person who encounters it without context. But a person who encounters it with context, a person whose tradition includes the specific knowledge of what this mark means and what its presence in this location signifies, would understand it immediately. It is, perhaps, a marker. A sign that says something specific about this location, about the resources nearby, about the obligations that this place carries, about the beings that are connected to it in the dreaming. It is a word, in a language, that has no letters, written on a surface that has been here longer than most of the world's civilizations have existed. Who wrote it? When? What did they mean? These are questions that the stone does not answer on its own. But they are real questions. The stone is real. The marks are real. The meaning is real, somewhere, in the tradition of the people whose country this is. The civilization that made this mark is not lost. It is not fully understood. It is not fully documented or fully investigated or fully appreciated by the world that exists around it. But it is present. It persists. In the stone, in the sky. In the living community of people whose ancestors were making marks on stone in this landscape at a time when the rest of the human story was just beginning to find its feet. That community and that persistence and that extraordinary depth of human time in one specific landscape is what Australia's ancient history is actually about. Not the sensational, not the conspiratorial, not the sensationalized mystery of civilization that appears and vanishes without trace, but the quieter, deeper, more genuinely astonishing mystery of civilization that appeared and stayed, that persisted through everything. That is still here, damaged but alive, carrying knowledge that the world has not yet found the wisdom to ask for. Ask for it. The asking is the beginning of understanding. And now, let the red earth hold you. Let the dark sky carry you. Let the ancient silence of the continent, the silence that has settled over the stone arrangements and the channel systems and the marked stones of the interior across all these thousands of years, let that silence come in through your breathing and settle around your thoughts and carry you gently, the way all ancient things carry those who are willing to be carried, into the deep and patient dark. The investigation continues. The story is not finished. The landscape remembers. Sleep well. There is something that happens to a person who spends extended time in the Australian interior. It does not happen all at once. It builds slowly, over days and weeks of walking in country, where the distances are so large that the idea of getting anywhere quickly becomes irrelevant, where the silence is not the absence of sound but a positive presence, where the light at the end of the day touches the red earth in ways that nothing in the ordinary world quite prepares you for. What happens is a shift in scale, a shift in how much time feels like it is and how much it contains. In the ordinary world, a week is substantial, a year is significant, a decade is enough to transform a life. But in the Australian interior, surrounded by rocks that formed before life was complex, by landscapes that have been shaped across spans that dwarf the entire human story, a different kind of time perception begins to settle in. Not the panicked recognition of human brevity that sometimes comes in confrontation with geological scale. Something calmer than that. A sense that time is larger than the categories we usually apply to it, and that human activity within that larger time is both very small and very significant in ways that are not contradictory. This sense of scale is, perhaps, something that the people who have lived in the Australian landscape for 65,000 years know in ways that people from shorter tenured traditions do not. Not as a philosophical idea, but as a lived reality. The knowledge that you are the current expression of a human presence in this landscape that extends back further than the beginning of any other civilization on Earth gives you a relationship to time that is simply different from the die. Relationship available to someone whose cultural tradition is a few thousand years old. It is a relationship that includes the past, not as something gone, but as something present. Not as something to be studied from outside, but as something inhabited. The people who built the stone arrangements did not leave this country. Their descendants are here. The knowledge they carried did not vanish when they died. It passed, imperfectly but substantially, into the traditions that persist today. The landscape they managed is still, in its deep structure, the landscape that their management made. The modifications, the careful fire regimes, and the channel systems and the stone structures are still here, still legible to those who know how to read them. This is what continuous occupation of a specific landscape across 65,000 years means. It means that the past is not past in the way that the past is past in traditions with shorter histories. It means that the people living in the landscape today are, in a genuine sense, still living in the landscape that their remote ancestors made. Their presence and their knowledge are continuous with that ancient making in ways that have no parallel anywhere else in the human world. This continuity is, I think, one of the things that makes Australia's ancient history so difficult for people from other traditions to fully grasp. We are accustomed to thinking of ancient history as something that ended, as a record of things that happened before the present began. But in Australia, the ancient history did not end. It transformed, was damaged, was disrupted, was partially lost, but it did not end. The people are still here. The knowledge is still here, some of it. The landscape is still here, shaped by all those thousands of years of human engagement. The past is present in a way that it is simply not present in traditions whose continuity has been broken by conquest or migration, or the kind of civilizational collapse that genuinely erases what came before. Taking this seriously changes what investigation of Australia's ancient history means and what it requires. It is not archaeology in the ordinary sense, the excavation of what is buried and gone. It is something closer to conversation, the engagement with what is present and living, however damaged, however incomplete, in the community that has maintained its connection to this history across everything that was thrown against it. The megastructures are not lost, they are waiting. The channels still hold the shape of the engineering that made them. The stone arrangements still mark the alignments they were built to mark. The astronomical knowledge still encodes the observations that make it precisely accurate. The ecological knowledge still describes the landscape with a precision that no alternative source can match. What is needed is not discovery. Discovery implies that the thing was hidden, unknown, absent. What is needed is recognition. Recognition that what is here has always been here, has never ceased to be here, and has been waiting for a broader human community to develop the eyes and the ears and the willingness to receive what it has to say. That recognition is slowly beginning to develop. It is developing in the scientific literature, where each new study of Aboriginal astronomical traditions or ecological practices or aquacultural engineering adds to the picture of a civilization more sophisticated than the standard model allows. It is developing in conservation practice, where the results of traditional management methods are demonstrating their superiority to the alternatives. It is developing in the legal and political sphere, where the recognition of Aboriginal land rights and the increasing authority of traditional owners over the management of their country is creating conditions in which the knowledge traditions that underlie that management can be more fully expressed. And it is developing, perhaps, in the broader public consciousness, in the growing recognition that Australia's ancient human history is not a footnote to the main story of world civilization, but one of its most remarkable chapters. Not because it fits the templates that Western history has established for what civilization looks like, because it challenges those templates, because it suggests that the templates are wrong, because it points toward a different understanding of what human beings can achieve and what achievements are most worth having. The investigation of Australia's lost megastructures is, in the end, an investigation of what civilization means, of what matters in the long sweep of human time, of what constitutes achievement when achievement is measured not in the monuments that survive a few thousand years before the desert reclaims them, but in the sustained, careful, intergenerational work of living well in a specific place and leaving it better than you found it for the people who will come after you. By that measure, the civilization that built in Australia is not lost at all. It is the most successful civilization in human history, the most durable, the most adaptive, the most ecologically intelligent, the most deeply rooted in a specific place and a specific relationship with that place that any human civilization has ever achieved. That it was not recognized as civilization, that its achievements were dismissed as primitive, that the knowledge it contained was suppressed and disrupted and partially lost. These are among the greatest failures of the human experiment to date. Greater, in their way, than any war or any famine or any technological catastrophe, because they represent the loss of accumulated knowledge that took 65,000 years to develop and that cannot be reconstructed once the thread is fully broken. The thread is not fully broken. That is the important thing. It is frayed, in places almost severed, but it holds. And the people who hold it are asking not to be admired or pitied or studied from outside, but to be recognized as the holders of knowledge that matters and to be supported in the work of maintaining and transmitting and applying that knowledge in a world that needs it desperately. That is the message that the megastructures carry. That is what the stone arrangements aligned to the stars are saying. That is what the channels cut through rock to manage the flow of ancient waters are recording in the landscape. That is what the marks on the stone in the central desert have been saying for as long as they have been there. We built this. We understood this. We cared for this across more time than you have yet been able to measure. And we are still here. Listen, the night is very quiet now. The fires have burned down to coals across the length and breadth of the continent, in the camps of the communities whose ancestors built what we have been discussing tonight. The stars are turning overhead, the stars that those communities know by name and story and seasonal position, that they have been tracking and recording and interpreting for longer than any other human tradition alive. The red earth is cooling in the dark, breathing out the heat it absorbed during the day, the heat that makes the Australian interior so challenging and so extraordinary. Somewhere in the rock country of the Pilbara, the marks on the stone are catching the last light of the moon before it sets. In the Channel country of southwestern Queensland, the dried beds of the ancient waterways hold the shape of the engineering that once managed them through seasons of flood and drought. In the highlands of Victoria, the stone of the Budj Bim system is settling deeper into the earth it has rested on for 6,000 years, patient and purposeful and still. The civilization that built these things is not a mystery to be solved and filed away. It is a presence to be recognized and engaged with, in all its complexity, in all its depth, in all its extraordinary duration. It is the oldest continuous human achievement on Earth, and it is here, in the landscape, in the knowledge, in the living community of people who have maintained their connection to it across everything. Take it with you as you sleep. The knowledge that the human story is longer and stranger and more extraordinary than you have been told, that the category of civilization is both narrower and wider than the textbooks suggest, that the oldest and most durable achievements of the human experiment are not the ones that appear in the history books, but the ones that are written in the landscape and in the knowledge and in the continuity of communities that have been here for 65,000 years and counting. That is the gift of Australia's ancient past, not the sensation of mystery, though the mystery is real, not the excitement of discovery, though the discovery is ongoing, but the quieter, deeper gift of perspective, of scale, of the recognition that the human experiment is older than we thought and more capable than we assumed and more connected to the specific places and the specific knowledge and the specific relationships with the natural world than the civilization we currently inhabit has yet remembered how to be. Let that recognition carry you into sleep. Let the ancient continent breathe in the dark around you. Let the stars turn overhead, patient and precise, as they have turned above every human generation that has looked up at them from this part of the earth, back to the very first people who arrived on this shore and looked up and began, with the same curiosity and the same intelligence and the same essential humanity that you carry tonight, to learn the names of what they saw. You are part of that story, not its end, not its culmination, but one of its countless continuations. One more human mind in one more moment of the long, extraordinary, still unfinished project of understanding the world and our place within it. Rest in that. Rest well. Good night. Before we finally let the night settle completely over this journey, there is one more passage I want to walk with you. One more corner of the ancient Australian past that deserves more than the passing acknowledgement it usually receives. We have spoken about the landscape evidence, the physical marks in the earth and the stone and the sky that tell of a civilization older and more organized than the standard account allows. We have spoken about the knowledge traditions, the astronomical and ecological and hydraulic knowledge that represents the most thoroughly tested body of practical science in human existence. We have spoken about the maritime connections, the genetic signatures and the biological markers, and the coastal structures that suggest Australia was not as isolated as the simple geography implies. But we have not spoken, in sufficient depth, about the people themselves, the individuals, the lives. What it was to be a particular human being in this civilization, with a name and relationships, and a specific place in the web of obligations and knowledge and ceremony that structured the world they inhabited. This may seem like an impossible thing to speak about. The people who built the stone arrangements of the central desert and managed the fisheries of the coastal wetlands and maintained the astronomical records across all those generations are, individually, unknown. Their names are not preserved. Their specific contributions are not recorded. They are absorbed into the collective past of their communities in a way that the historical traditions of other cultures have not always been comfortable with, because the Western tradition valorizes the individual and the individual's achievement in ways that the Aboriginal Australian tradition does not. But let me try to bring one of them into focus. Not a specific historical individual, because that is beyond what the evidence allows, but a composite portrait built from what the evidence tells us of a particular kind of person at a particular kind of moment in the long history of this civilization. Imagine a woman in her 50s, which, in the context of a community without the specific stressors of agricultural disease and nutritional deficiency that early farming communities faced, places her at the height of her social and intellectual authority. She is not old in the sense that the word implies diminishment. She is elder in the sense that it implies the opposite, the accumulation of experience and knowledge, and the social standing that comes from decades of demonstrated competence and contribution. She knows the water. It is her specific responsibility, inherited from the woman who taught her, who inherited it from the woman before her, back through a line of custodians, that she does not count in the way that a genealogist would count them, but that she knows runs back to the time before memory, to the dreaming, to the moment when the waterways were made and the obligations to care for them were established. Her knowledge of the water in her country is not abstract, it is intimate. She knows which section of the channel is most vulnerable to silting after heavy rains. She knows which weir needs to have its stones adjusted as the season shifts and the fish population changes. She knows which pools are productive in drought years when the channels run low, because the springs that feed those pools come from a different source than the rainfall-dependent surface water that fills the channels in the wet season. She knows which plants on the bank of the main channel are the indicators of changes in the water table, and she reads those plants the way another person might read a map. She also knows the sky. Not in the specialized depth of the men who hold the primary responsibility for astronomical knowledge in her community, but enough to know the seasonal calendar, to know when the birds will be coming through, to know when the time is approaching for the gathering that brings her community together with the communities from the north and the east and the west. She knows when to expect floods and when to expect drought, not with the certainty that a meteorological forecast provides, but with the kind of confident, probabilistic knowledge that comes from a lifetime of observation correlated with the knowledge of the lifetimes before her. She knows her landscape in the way that you know your own body, not always consciously, not always explicitly, but in a way that is more reliable than explicit knowledge, because it does not depend on conscious recall. She knows where she is in the landscape at any moment. She knows what is around the next bend in the channel before she reaches it, not from memory of having visited that specific place recently, but from the kind of accumulated topographic understanding that comes from living in a landscape long enough and attentively enough that the landscape becomes, in some sense, internal. And she knows her community. She knows every person in it with the specific, particular, irreplaceable knowledge that comes from living in close proximity with the same group of people across decades. She knows their strengths and their difficult places, their particular kinds of knowledge and the gaps in their knowledge. She knows who needs to be paired with whom to make a particular piece of work come out well. She knows whose judgment to trust in specific domains and when to override the consensus in the direction she thinks is right. And she knows how to do that without breaking the social fabric that makes the community function. This knowledge is the invisible infrastructure of the civilization we have been discussing tonight. It is what makes the engineering work and the knowledge traditions persist and the ecological management succeed. Not the technical knowledge alone, but the knowledge of the people who hold the technical knowledge and of how to bring those people together in the right combinations to achieve the right outcomes. The social intelligence, the management of relationships that is, in any civilization, the foundation on which everything else rests. We do not see this woman in the stone arrangements or the channel systems or the rock engravings. She leaves no individual trace. She is part of the collective past. But she was there. She was real. She held knowledge that we cannot fully recover and made decisions that shape the landscape in ways that persist today. She was, by any reasonable measure, one of the most knowledgeable and most influential people of her time, and she is unknown. That unknownness is not a failure of the record. It is a feature of the civilization. A civilization that did not prize individual fame and individual achievement above the collective and the communal did not build monuments to its outstanding individuals. It built the kind of infrastructure, both physical and social, that made collective life possible and sustained it across generations. The monument is the landscape. The monument is the knowledge tradition. The monument is the continuous presence of the community in its country across 65,000 years. It is a different kind of monument from the ones that fill our history books, but it is more durable and, I would argue, more genuinely impressive. Let me turn now to a thread that runs through the entire evening and that I have touched on repeatedly but not addressed directly. The thread of time. The scale of Australian ancient history is so large that our ordinary intuitions about time simply do not apply to it. We have numbers: 65,000 years, 100,000 years, 300,000 years for the geological formations, billions of years for the basement rock. But numbers at this scale are experientially empty. We cannot feel what 65,000 years is. We cannot intuit the depth of history implied by a tradition that predates the oldest writing by 60,000 years or the oldest pyramid by 61,000 years. What we can do is try to find an angle of approach that gives the numbers some purchase on the imagination. Consider this. The period from the beginning of the agricultural revolution to the present day is approximately 10,000 years. In that 10,000 years, human civilization has gone from the first deliberate planting of seeds to quantum computers and space exploration. That is the span of what we call history, and it is sufficient to encompass the entire transformation of human life from Neolithic village to global technological civilization. Now multiply that span by 6.5. That is how long people have been present in Australia. In a single span of time equal to 6.5 entire histories of civilization as we know it, the Aboriginal Australian civilization has maintained its presence in its specific landscape, developing, adapting, accumulating knowledge, managing the ecosystem, maintaining the traditions. 6.5 times the entire span of everything that has happened since the first city was built. If civilization can transform from Neolithic village to space exploration in one span of that length, what was happening in Australia across 6.5 spans? What was being developed, refined, discarded, reinvented, accumulated across all that time? We cannot know. Most of it has left no recoverable trace, because it was built from organic materials and carried in human minds and expressed in practices that are visible in the landscape only to those who know how to read them. But the knowledge traditions that survive give us a hint. The astronomical precision of the Aboriginal sky knowledge was not achieved in a generation or a century. It required sustained observation across many generations, refinement of observation methods, correction of accumulated error, development of the transmission mechanisms that maintained accuracy. All of that takes time. Not 100 years, not 1,000 years. Tens of thousands of years, in which each generation added something to what it received and passed on something more complete than what it inherited. The ecological knowledge is the same. The precision of the knowledge of specific plant species and their properties and their relationships to other species and to the conditions of specific landscapes is not achievable in a single human lifetime or even in a few generations. It requires the kind of multi-generational accumulation of observation and inference and testing that is only possible in a tradition that maintains continuity across very long periods. The knowledge of which specific rare plant, available in which specific location, at which specific time of year, processed in which specific way, produces relief for which specific symptom, is not derived from first principles. It is derived from tens of thousands of years of trying things and observing results and passing on the successful observations to the next generation. This is why the Aboriginal Australian knowledge traditions are so extraordinary. Not just because they are precise, though they are, not just because they are comprehensive, though they are that too, but because of what their precision and comprehensiveness imply about the duration and the consistency of the intellectual project that produced them, a project of understanding and managing a specific landscape that has been underway for longer than any other intellectual project in human history. And it is why the loss of elements of that tradition, through the disruption of colonialism, is so catastrophic and so irreversible. When a specific knowledge holder dies without fully transmitting what they know, the knowledge that dies with them is not just what they personally learned in their lifetime. It is the accumulated refinement of all the lifetimes that preceded theirs in the specific lineage of knowledge they held. It is as if a library burned, but a library built not across centuries but across tens of thousands of years, each generation adding its careful contributions and each loss removing not just the current layer but all the previous layers that fed into it. This is not hyperbole. It is the literal description of what has happened and what continues to happen as Aboriginal knowledge traditions are disrupted and the holders of specific knowledge elements die without successors. The knowledge that exists in those traditions is not replaceable from outside. It cannot be reconstructed by Western science. Western science can identify some of the outcomes that the knowledge produces and can sometimes reverse engineer the mechanism. But the full depth of the knowledge, with all its contextual layers and all its relational complexity and all its embeddedness in the specific landscape and the specific community and the specific ceremonial framework, cannot be reconstructed. It can only be maintained by the communities that hold it if those communities are given the conditions they need to do so. Those conditions include land. The knowledge of the landscape cannot be maintained by communities separated from the landscape. It requires presence in country. The burning cannot be practiced without the land to burn. The fish management cannot be continued without access to the waterways. The astronomical observations cannot be verified without the night sky of the specific latitude. The knowledge lives in the land and in the practice of managing the land, and removing communities from their land removes them from the conditions in which their knowledge can survive. Those conditions also include language. A significant portion of Aboriginal Australian knowledge is encoded in specific linguistic forms that have no adequate translation into English or other European languages. The technical vocabulary of ecological knowledge, the specific terms for specific relationships between species and conditions and times, does not map onto English, because English evolved in a context where those relationships did not exist in the forms they exist in Australia. When a language dies, the knowledge that it alone can precisely encode dies with it, and those conditions include time. The transmission of deep knowledge across generations is not a process that can be hurried. It requires sustained, intimate, long-term engagement between knowledge holders and the next generation of knowledge holders in the specific contexts where the knowledge is expressed and tested. It cannot be rushed into recording sessions or written down in a form that fully captures what it contains. It requires the kind of immersive, extended, relationship-based learning that is only possible when communities have the stability and the continuity to maintain it. All of these conditions are under pressure. In some places, they are absent. The investigation of Australia's ancient history is therefore inseparable from the urgent practical work of supporting Aboriginal communities in maintaining the conditions under which their knowledge can survive. This is not a separate project from the investigation. It is the investigation. Because without the living tradition, the physical evidence cannot be fully read, and without the physical evidence, the living tradition cannot be fully grounded. They need each other. And they need the support of a broader community that understands why they matter and what is at stake in their preservation. Let me bring you back, one more time, to the landscape itself. The great stone plateau of the Central Australian desert at night is unlike any other place on Earth. The sky above it is extraordinary, not just because of the absence of light pollution, though that is part of it, but because of the altitude and the clarity of the desert air that make the stars appear closer and more numerous than they appear from almost any other inhabited place. The Milky Way is not a faint smear across the sky. It is a presence, overwhelming in its density and its detail, an architecture of light so complex and so vast that looking at it for any sustained period produces a specific kind of vertigo, a sense of the scale of what lies beyond, and the smallness of the vantage point from which it is observed. From the surface of this plateau, human beings have been looking at this sky for 65,000 years. The specific individuals who looked at it in the very earliest years of human occupation of this landscape are separated from us by all the generations that have lived and died in the intervening time. But their looking was the beginning of a project of observation and recording and interpretation that has never stopped. That continues tonight, in the knowledge traditions of the communities whose ancestors began it. When a knowledge holder in one of those communities looks up at the Milky Way tonight and sees in its dark spaces the shape of the emu, they are looking with eyes that carry the accumulated looking of 65,000 years. They are seeing what their ancestors learned to see, and passing on the seeing to those who will come after them. The continuity is not metaphorical. It is literal. The looking continues. The knowledge persists. That is the extraordinary thing. Not that the knowledge exists, not that it is precise, but that it continues, that against every disruption and every pressure and every attempt to suppress and displace and replace it, the tradition maintains. Not perfectly, not everywhere, but substantially, in enough places, through enough knowledge holders, to still be present, still be alive, still be capable of teaching what it has always taught. This persistence is itself the most impressive achievement of the civilization we have been discussing tonight. More impressive than the aquaculture systems, though they are remarkable. More impressive than the stone arrangements, though they are extraordinary. More impressive than the astronomical knowledge, though it is among the most sophisticated knowledge traditions in human history. The persistence of the tradition itself, across 65,000 years, and the disruption of colonial encounter is the achievement that exceeds anything else we have considered tonight. It is the achievement of people who were committed, generation after generation, to the maintenance of what they had received and to the transmission of it to those who would come after them. People who understood, at a deep level, that the most important thing they could do was not to build something that would outlast them, but to pass on something to the people who would outlast them. Not to achieve, but to transmit. Not to accumulate, but to continue. That is a different kind of ambition from the kind that builds pyramids and empires. But it is an ambition that has proven, in the Australian case, more durable than any pyramid and more resilient than any empire. The pyramid falls eventually. The empire dissolves. But the knowledge that says this is how the water moves in this channel, and this is why the emu on the ground is where the emu in the sky is, and this is the obligation that connects you to this place and to the generations before and after you, that knowledge, properly maintained, can persist for longer than any physical monument. It has, in Australia. And that is the deepest and most important thing that Australia's ancient history has to teach. Not the shock of the anomalous, not the thrill of the mysterious, not the sensation of conspiracy or the excitement of forbidden knowledge, but the quiet, extraordinary, deeply moving fact that human beings, given the right conditions and the right values and the right understanding of what matters, can maintain a civilization across 65,000 years without destroying the landscape that supports it, without losing the knowledge that makes it function, and without breaking the thread of connection between the present and the past that gives life its depth and its meaning. That civilization exists. It existed here, in Australia, for longer than anywhere else. It is still here, diminished but alive. And understanding it, taking it seriously, supporting the conditions in which it can continue, is one of the most important things that the broader human community can do right now. The stars are very clear tonight over the plateau. The emu in the sky is visible, turning slowly toward the position that will tell the people who know how to read it that the time is approaching for the eggs. The channels in the wetland country are quiet in the dark, holding the shape of the engineering that has managed this water for thousands of years. The stone on the hillside holds the marks made by hands that have returned to the earth, but whose knowledge has not. Somewhere in a community tonight, someone is teaching, slowly, in the way that knowledge of this depth requires to be taught, with patience and repetition and demonstration and story, teaching what they received, and what they have refined, and what they will pass on, adding their small contribution to the extraordinary accumulation that is the intellectual achievement of Australian ancient civilization. That teaching is the most important megastructure of all, not carved in stone, not marked on the landscape, but real, durable, and still being built. Sleep now. Carry with you, into the dark of your own night, the knowledge that the human story is longer and stranger and more extraordinary than you usually allow yourself to remember. That the deepest chapter of that story is still being lived in this ancient continent by the people whose ancestors wrote it. That the past is present, the knowledge is alive, the tradition continues. And that is extraordinary. Rest well. This is where we leave the Red Country tonight. Somewhere behind us, the great stone arrangements are catching the first grey light of a dawn that is not yet visible from wherever you are. The channels are beginning to move again as the morning air shifts the water in the ancient directions. The stars are fading, though the people who know them best understand that fading is not absence, that the stars are there in the day sky too, following the same paths, telling the same stories, maintaining the same relationships that they have maintained since the first human eyes in this landscape learned to see them. The investigation continues in the morning. There are sites still to be found, still to be documented, still to be understood in their full context. There are knowledge traditions still to be recorded, relationships still to be built between outside researchers and the communities who hold the knowledge that makes those traditions intelligible. There are conversations still to be had between the world that is waking up to Australia's ancient past and the world that has always known it, between the scientific tradition that is beginning to take the evidence seriously and the living tradition that has always taken it seriously. Those conversations will happen. Some of them have already begun. And from them, over time, with patience and respect and the willingness to be changed by what is learned, a fuller and more accurate understanding of Australia's ancient history will emerge. An understanding that places this continent not at the margins of human history, but at its deepest, oldest, most extraordinary center. An understanding that recognizes the civilization that has been here for 65,000 years as what it is. The most durable, the most knowledgeable, the most ecologically sophisticated, and the most deeply rooted human civilization that has ever existed anywhere on Earth. An understanding that changes not just how we think about the past, but how we think about the present and the future, about what civilization can be, about what knowledge can do, about what the right relationship between human beings and the landscapes they inhabit looks like when it is maintained across the kind of time it takes to get it truly right. Australia has that answer. It has had it for a very long time. We are only just beginning to ask the question. Good night. From the country that has been waiting, patient as stone, for the question to arrive, one last thing before the silence takes over completely. There is a practice that exists in certain Aboriginal communities, a practice that has no exact parallel in other traditions, and that, when you understand what it is, stops you completely. It is the practice of teaching the land to the next generation by walking it, not describing it, not pointing to it on a map, not explaining it in a classroom, walking it, covering the ground, together, the knowledge holder and the student, step by step, landmark by landmark, waterhole by waterhole, stone arrangement by stone arrangement. The knowledge that is transmitted in that walking cannot be fully transmitted any other way, because the knowledge is not separable from the walking. It is not information about the landscape. It is the landscape, understood through the body, through the physical experience of being in it, moving through it, feeling the ground change under your feet and the air change around you and the light change as the sun moves across the sky above you. It is knowledge that lives in the relationship between a specific human body and a specific piece of ground, and that can only be transmitted by establishing that relationship in the body of the student. This is why the removal of communities from their country is so devastating. It does not just remove people from a place they love, it removes them from the medium through which their knowledge is transmitted and maintained. The knowledge of a specific waterway cannot be adequately maintained by a community living 100 kilometers from that waterway. The knowledge of a specific stone arrangement cannot be adequately maintained by a community that has not walked to that arrangement in a generation. The knowledge dies not all at once, but gradually, as the connection between the knowledge and the ground that it describes is severed. The restoration of communities to their country is therefore not just a matter of justice, though it is certainly that. It is a matter of knowledge preservation, the most urgent and irreplaceable form of knowledge preservation currently happening anywhere in Australia. The walk back to country is the walk back to the living knowledge that no book and no recording and no museum collection can substitute for. Some communities are making that walk. With the support of land rights legislation and land trusts and native title determinations, some of the communities whose connection to their country was severed by colonial dispossession are returning. And as they return, the knowledge is showing signs of reviving. The plants that were known by specific names in specific locations are being re-identified. The channels that were managed in specific ways are being walked and examined. The stone arrangements that were understood in the context of the ceremonial tradition are being revisited, and the tradition is providing partially, hesitantly, the context that makes them readable. This is not a complete recovery. It cannot be. The disruption was too severe and too long-lasting, and too many knowledge holders died before the conditions for transmission were restored. But it is something. It is the beginning of a reconnection between living knowledge and the landscape that the knowledge describes. And from that reconnection, something is growing. What is growing is not simply the recovery of old knowledge, though that is part of it. What is growing is the development of new knowledge, built on the foundation of the old, adapted to the conditions of the present, shaped by the specific challenges and opportunities of the contemporary relationship between these communities and their country. Knowledge about how the landscape has changed since the disruption, and what the old knowledge suggests about how to respond to those changes. Knowledge about which traditional management practices can be restored directly and which need to be adapted to the changed conditions of the landscape. Knowledge about which aspects of the traditional understanding of the relationship between community and country are directly applicable to the present, and which need to be understood more metaphorically, as principles, rather than as specific practices. This is how living traditions work. They are not static, they adapt. They incorporate new circumstances and new knowledge while maintaining the deep continuity that gives them their integrity and their depth. The Aboriginal Australian tradition has been doing this for 65,000 years. It is doing it now. And the evidence of that adaptation and continuation is, in its own way, as remarkable as the aquaculture systems and the stone arrangements and the astronomical traditions that we have been discussing tonight. It is the evidence that the civilization is not over, that the story is not finished, that the oldest continuous human tradition on Earth is still going, still developing, still adding to the extraordinary accumulation that is the intellectual and spiritual and practical achievement of 65,000 years of human life in this specific place. That is the note on which I want to close tonight's journey. Not with the mystery, though the mystery is real and important and far from resolved. Not with the evidence of what was built in the deep past, though that evidence is extraordinary and demands the serious investigation it has not yet received, but with the present tense, with the civilization that is alive, that is here, that is doing the work of maintaining and transmitting and adapting the knowledge that is its greatest achievement. The megastructures are remarkable. The aquaculture systems are engineering achievements that deserve recognition as among the most sophisticated achievements of the deep human past. The stone arrangements and the astronomical traditions and the maritime connections and all the other evidence we have examined tonight deserve the serious, funded, collaborative investigation that has so far been inadequate to the task. But the most remarkable thing, in the end, is the people who are still here. The communities who have maintained their connection to their country and their tradition through everything that has been done to sever it. The knowledge holders who are still walking their country and teaching what they know to those who come after them. The elders who are still performing the ceremonies that maintain the relationships between community and landscape and sky, and the accumulated generations of the past that have always been the heart of this civilization. They are here. The civilization is alive. The story continues. And that, more than anything else that has been said tonight, is what deserves to be recognized. Not as a remnant, not as a relic, as a living presence. As the continuation of the oldest civilization on Earth, still carrying the knowledge that it has always carried, still maintaining the relationships that have always defined it, still adding to the extraordinary accumulation that it has been building for 65,000 years. In the morning, the investigation will continue. The questions will persist. The evidence will wait, patient as the landscape that contains it, for the attention and the resources and the collaborative engagement that will eventually allow it to be fully read. But tonight, in the quiet at the end of this long journey through Australia's ancient past, it is enough to rest with the knowledge that the story is not over, that the civilization is present, that the land remembers everything that has happened in it and is still, in its ancient, patient way, speaking. To those who have learned to listen, to those who will learn to listen, to all of us, in the dark, wherever we are tonight, who are part of the same human story that began here, in this ancient place, 65,000 years ago, and has not yet reached its end. Sleep well. The land is watching over you, as it has watched over every human being who has ever rested in its country. Ancient and patient and full of knowledge, and still, after all this time, speaking, listen. Even in sleep, listen. Good night. The red earth holds everything that has been placed in it. The stone holds the marks made upon it. The sky holds the knowledge mapped into its patterns across 65,000 years of patient watching. The water holds the shape of the channels that directed it through the seasons of uncounted years. The tradition holds the meaning of all of it, the why behind the what, the relationship behind the engineering, the civilization behind the structure, and the night holds you. Wherever you are, in whatever corner of the world, in whatever hour this voice finds you drifting toward the edge of sleep, the night holds you the way it has held every human being who has ever closed their eyes and let the day release its grip and trusted the dark to carry them through until the morning. You are safe. The investigation is continuing. The knowledge is present. The civilization is alive. The land is ancient and patient and speaking to those who listen. Let go of the day. Let the questions rest. Let the megastructures stand in their patient places across the red continent, holding their alignments and their secrets and their extraordinary depth of time, waiting for the morning and the continued work of understanding. You have traveled far tonight. Rest now. The ancient country is watching over you. Good night. From the stone plateau of the central desert to the tidal channels of the northern coast, from the ancient highlands of the southeast to the deep silence of the interior that has held human life longer than anywhere else on Earth, the continent breathes tonight, as it has always breathed, as it will breathe tomorrow and in all the tomorrows that come after. The oldest inhabited place on Earth, patient, ancient, full of knowledge, still speaking to anyone willing to be still enough and quiet enough to hear. You have heard tonight. That is enough. Sleep.